Our minds operate like sophisticated accounting systems when we experience hurt. Every slight gets carefully recorded, every injustice receives a precise emotional value, and every wound accumulates interest over time. This invisible ledger shapes how we navigate relationships, seek justice, and ultimately choose between revenge and forgiveness. Behind every family feud, every workplace conflict, and every international dispute lies a complex system of emotional mathematics that most people never consciously recognize. We carry these calculations with us everywhere we go. The friend who betrayed our trust receives a negative balance that affects every future interaction. The colleague who took credit for our work gets entered into our mental spreadsheet with compound interest accumulating daily. The family member who disappointed us at a crucial moment becomes a permanent liability in our emotional portfolio. These unconscious calculations influence who we trust, who we avoid, who we help, and who we secretly hope will suffer some karmic justice. Understanding this hidden mathematics reveals why humans struggle so profoundly with forgiveness and why revenge feels so intoxicatingly satisfying. The fascinating truth is that our brains evolved these accounting systems for survival in small tribal groups, where reputation and reciprocity meant life or death. But in our modern world of complex relationships and global connections, these ancient calculation methods often create more problems than they solve. The emotional mathematics that once protected our ancestors now trap us in cycles of resentment that can last decades or even generations. Yet the same scientific understanding that reveals how these systems work also points toward more sophisticated equations for human flourishing. Part 1. The Architecture of Emotional Debt. When someone wrongs us, our brains immediately begin an accounting process that operates with remarkable precision and complexity, but follows rules that would horrify any trained accountant. Unlike financial ledgers that deal in objective currencies, our emotional accounting systems assign values based on a bewildering array of subjective factors that can transform identical actions into vastly different emotional debts. A harsh word from a stranger might register as a minor expense, barely worth recording. The exact same word from a beloved friend becomes a major liability that can destabilize our entire emotional portfolio. Our minds do not simply catalogue what happened, but rather create elaborate valuations based on who did it, when they did it, how they did it, why we think they did it, and what it means for our fundamental sense of safety and worth in the world. This invisible pricing system shapes every relationship we have. The valuation process begins with what psychologists call the relationship premium. Actions from people we love and trust carry exponentially higher emotional values than identical behaviors from casual acquaintances or strangers. When a romantic partner forgets our birthday, our emotional accounting system calculates not just the disappointment of the missed celebration, but the implications for how much we matter to them, whether they truly know us, if our relationship is deteriorating, and what this predicts about future care and attention. The simple oversight gets multiplied by trust, expectation, vulnerability, and hope to create an emotional debt that might exceed anything recorded in our ledger with people we barely know. This relationship premium explains why family conflicts feel so devastatingly expensive, while similar disagreements with co-workers might barely register as minor transactions. The people with the greatest access to our emotional accounts have the power to create the largest debts. Context and timing function as emotional interest rates that can dramatically inflate or reduce the value of any particular offence. Criticism delivered during a moment of vulnerability gets calculated at premium rates. Being dismissed when we are already struggling feels exponentially more costly than the same dismissal during a period of confidence and success. Public humiliation receives higher emotional valuation than private correction because it includes not just the direct hurt but the compound interest of social embarrassment, reputation damage, and the ongoing anxiety about what others now think of us. A betrayal during a crisis carries emergency surcharges that can multiply the base emotional cost by factors of 10 or more. Our accounting systems recognize that timing is everything when calculating the true price of human cruelty or kindness. Cultural background and personal history create what we might call emotional exchange rates that determine how different types of hurts translate into actual psychological impact. Someone raised in a culture that highly values respect for elders will calculate disrespectful behavior toward older family members at premium rates. A person with a history of abandonment will assign catastrophic values to even minor signs of rejection or withdrawal. Past trauma functions like compound interest applied retroactively, where current hurts get multiplied by historical wounds to create emotional debts that seem wildly disproportionate to outside observers. The harsh criticism that barely registers for someone with secure self-esteem becomes a devastating blow for someone whose confidence has been systematically undermined throughout their life. Our emotional accounting systems do not operate in isolation, but rather integrate our entire biographical database when calculating the true cost of any particular injury. The categorization process itself reveals sophisticated distinctions that rival any professional accounting framework. Our minds distinguish between crimes of commission and omission, calculating active harm differently from passive neglect. Intentional cruelty receives maximum penalties, while thoughtless mistakes might qualify for reduced emotional sentencing. Repeated offences trigger escalating fee structures where the 10th instance of the same behaviour costs exponentially more than the first. Our systems also track patterns across time, recognizing when isolated incidents reveal larger character flaws or when someone consistently demonstrates disregard for our well-being. A single lie might be processed as a minor debit, but a pattern of deception gets calculated as a fundamental threat to the entire relationship infrastructure. The role of witnesses and social validation adds another layer of complexity to our emotional accounting that has no parallel in financial systems. Being wronged in front of others multiplies the cost because it includes not just the direct harm, but the social implications of how we are perceived and treated by the community. When someone insults us privately, we calculate the personal injury. When they insult us publicly, we must also account for reputation damage, social embarrassment, and the ongoing cost of wondering what everyone else thinks about the incident. Conversely, public vindication or defense by others can actually reduce the emotional debt because it provides social validation that the offence was real and undeserved. Our accounting systems instinctively recognize that humans are social creatures whose individual well-being depends partly on group standing and community support. Power dynamics create what economists might recognize as market distortions in our emotional accounting systems. Harm from someone with authority over us carries additional charges because it threatens not just our emotional well-being, but our practical security. When a boss treats us unfairly, we calculate not only the personal slight, but the professional vulnerability, the limited options for retaliation, and the potential long-term career consequences. The emotional debt includes a helplessness premium that reflects our inability to respond proportionately without risking our livelihood. Similarly, harm inflicted on those we love and feel responsible for protecting gets multiplied by our sense of failure to shield them from injury. Parents often carry emotional debts related to their children's suffering that exceed even what the children themselves calculate. The expectation versus reality differential creates some of the most expensive entries in our emotional ledgers. Disappointment gets calculated not based on objective outcomes, but on the gap between what we hoped for and what actually occurred. Someone who promises us the world and delivers mediocrity creates a larger emotional debt than someone who promises nothing and delivers the same mediocre result. Holiday celebrations, milestone birthdays, graduations, and other significant occasions carry emotional futures contracts where the anticipated joy creates corresponding vulnerability to devastating disappointment. Our accounting systems track not just what happened, but what should have happened according to our internal models of love, friendship, family duty, and social obligation. The mathematics of unmet expectations can transform neutral events into major emotional liabilities simply because of the elaborate hopes we had constructed around them. Part 2. The compound interest of rumination. The most destructive feature of our emotional accounting systems lies not in how they record initial hurts, but in how they calculate ongoing interest through the psychological process known as rumination. This mental mechanism operates like the most predatory financial instrument ever conceived, applying compound interest rates that can transform minor slights into life-consuming obsessions within remarkably short periods. Unlike financial interest that compounds at predictable intervals, emotional interest compounds every time we revisit the memory, discuss the incident with others, encounter reminders of the offence, or even dream about the person who hurt us. A single betrayal experienced once becomes a betrayal relived hundreds or thousands of times, with each mental replay adding layers of interpretation, analysis, and emotional intensity that expand the original wound exponentially. The rumination process begins almost immediately after an emotional injury occurs, often before we have even left the scene of the offence. Our minds start replaying the incident, analysing what happened, imagining what we should have said or done differently, and calculating the implications for our future relationship with the offender. This initial processing might seem adaptive, helping us understand the situation and plan appropriate responses. But psychological research reveals that rumination quickly becomes a self-perpetuating cycle that generates far more emotional pain than it resolves. Each time we mentally revisit the scene, we add new details based on our current emotional state, incorporate insights from subsequent experiences, and apply increasingly sophisticated interpretive frameworks that were not available during the original incident. The hurt that was manageable in the moment becomes unbearable through accumulated mental interest. The mathematics of rumination follow predictable but devastating patterns that compound suffering across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Temporal amplification occurs when we imagine how the offence will affect our future, projecting current pain forward through months or years of anticipated consequences. A colleague who takes credit for our work does not just steal recognition for that single project, but potentially undermines our entire career trajectory. Our rumination calculations include the promotion we might not receive, the opportunities that may disappear, the reputation damage that could follow us to other jobs, and the self-doubt that might sabotage future performance. The original injury gets multiplied by every imagined future cost, creating emotional debts that dwarf the actual immediate harm. We suffer not just from what happened, but from elaborate mental projections of everything that might happen as a result. Social amplification adds another dimension to the compound interest calculation as we imagine how others perceive the offence and what it reveals about our status or worth. When someone insults us, rumination expands the injury to include speculation about whether witnesses agreed with the criticism, whether friends and family will lose respect for us, and whether the insult contains kernels of truth that others have noticed but been too polite to mention. We calculate not just the direct emotional cost of the harsh words, but the potential social consequences of being publicly diminished. The rumination process transforms a single person's opinion into a comprehensive referendum on our character, accomplishments, and place in the social hierarchy. A moment of criticism becomes weeks of anxiety about reputation, months of self-doubt about competence, and years of hypersensitivity to similar feedback from others. The interest compounds socially as well as temporally. Pattern recognition represents perhaps the most expensive form of rumination-based compound interest, where individual incidents become evidence for larger systemic problems that require comprehensive recalculation of multiple relationships and life assumptions. A friend who cancels plans at the last minute does not just disappoint us for that particular evening, but triggers rumination about whether this represents a pattern of disrespect, whether they value the friendship as much as we do, and whether we have been naive about their true feelings toward us. The rumination process searches our memory banks for similar incidents, reinterprets past interactions through the lens of current hurt, and constructs elaborate theories about ongoing mistreatment that may have been invisible before. What began as disappointment about missed dinner plans becomes a comprehensive audit of the entire friendship, with retroactive interest applied to every previously overlooked slight or moment of perceived indifference. The compound interest reaches backward through time as well as forward, transforming our understanding of the relationship's entire history. Rumination can make us feel like we have been systematically deceived or undervalued for years, when the evidence might support much more modest conclusions. The physiological dimension of rumination creates additional layers of compound interest through the body's stress response systems. Each time we mentally replay an emotional injury, our nervous system reactivates as if the offence were happening again in real time. Heart rate increases, stress hormones flood our bloodstream, muscle tension builds, and sleep patterns become disrupted. These physical responses create their own secondary costs that get added to our emotional accounting ledger. We suffer not just from the original psychological injury, but from the accumulated physical toll of reliving it repeatedly through rumination. Chronic stress from unresolved emotional debts contributes to headaches, digestive problems, immune system suppression, and cardiovascular strain that transform psychological wounds into legitimate health concerns. The compound interest operates simultaneously across mental, emotional, social, and physical dimensions, creating comprehensive suffering that seems wildly disproportionate to whatever originally triggered the rumination cycle. Our bodies keep the score even when our minds desperately want to move on. Memory distortion through rumination follows its own mathematical principles that consistently inflate emotional debts beyond their original values. Each time we recall an incident, our brains reconstruct the memory rather than simply retrieving a fixed recording. This reconstruction process is influenced by our current emotional state, subsequent experiences, conversations with others, and evolving understanding of the people involved. A harsh comment that felt merely rude at the time might be remembered as deliberately cruel after we learn more about the speaker's character. Facial expressions get reinterpreted as more malicious, tone of voice becomes more contemptuous, and motivations appear more calculated with each mental replay. The rumination process consistently biases memory reconstruction toward versions that support and intensify our current emotional state, creating false compound interest based on distorted recollections of events that may have been significantly milder than we now remember. The social sharing of emotional injuries creates viral compound interest, where rumination spreads beyond the original victim to include friends, family members, and allies who begin their own rumination cycles about the offence. When we tell others about how we have been wronged, we invite them to participate in our emotional accounting process. They add their own interpretations, share similar experiences, validate our anger, and often escalate our calculations by pointing out implications or injustices we had not considered. A single incident becomes the subject of multiple rumination processes occurring simultaneously across our social network, each generating its own compound interest that gets fed back to us through ongoing conversations and expressions of support. The mathematics become collective rather than individual, with entire groups calculating emotional debts and planning responses based on shared rumination about perceived wrongs. Family feuds, workplace conflicts, and community disputes often follow this pattern of distributed rumination, where the compound interest spreads like a psychological contagion that eventually involves people who were not even present for the original offence. Part 3. The Neuroscience of Revenge. Modern brain imaging technology has revealed that the human desire for revenge operates through specific neural circuits that create some of the most powerful and potentially destructive reward experiences our brains can generate. When we contemplate getting even with someone who has wronged us, sophisticated scanning equipment shows activation patterns in regions like the nucleus accumbens, dorsal striatum, and ventral tegmental area that are virtually identical to the neural signatures of drug addiction, gambling compulsion, and other behaviors that hijack our reward systems. The brain on revenge looks remarkably similar to the brain on cocaine, creating neurochemical experiences so intensely pleasurable that they can override rational decision-making and moral considerations that would normally constrain our behavior. Understanding these neural mechanisms explains why revenge feels so irresistibly satisfying in the moment, and why the pursuit of retribution can become genuinely addictive for some individuals. The anticipation phase of revenge activates what neuroscientists call the dopaminergic reward prediction pathway, flooding our brains with the same neurochemical that drives motivation for food, sex, social connection, and substance abuse. Dopamine levels surge not when we actually get revenge, but when we first begin contemplating the possibility of getting even. This creates a powerful neurochemical incentive to continue planning retaliation even before any action has been taken. Brain scans of people imagining revenge scenarios show activation patterns, suggesting they are experiencing genuine pleasure from merely thinking about how they might hurt those who have hurt them. The neural reward system treats revenge fantasies as if they were real experiences, providing immediate gratification that reinforces continued rumination and planning. This explains why we can spend hours pleasurably imagining elaborate schemes for getting even, without ever actually implementing them. The neurochemical payoff occurs during the planning phase, making revenge thoughts intrinsically rewarding, regardless of whether they lead to actual retaliation. Our brains evolved to find satisfaction in the mere contemplation of justice. The execution phase of revenge activates additional neural circuits related to dominance, control, and social status that provided evolutionary advantages in small tribal groups, where reputation and deterrence were matters of survival. When people actually follow through on revenge, Brain imaging shows increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and orbitofrontal cortex, regions associated with social cognition and the evaluation of outcomes relative to effort invested. The neural experience of successful retaliation includes not just the dopamine rush of achieved goals, but also the satisfaction of restored social equilibrium and demonstrated power. These brain systems evolved when humans lived in groups small enough that everyone knew everyone else, where backing down from aggression could lead to repeated victimization, and where the ability to inflict costs on those who harm you served as crucial deterrents against future attacks. Modern revenge activates ancient neural programs designed for environments where reputation for toughness meant the difference between social integration and dangerous isolation. The pleasure we feel from getting even reflects deep evolutionary programming that once served vital survival functions. However, the same neural circuits that make revenge initially pleasurable also create a devastating pattern of diminishing returns that mirrors the progression of drug addiction through tolerance and escalation. Neuroimaging studies reveal that the dopamine response to revenge decreases with repeated experiences, requiring increasingly elaborate or severe forms of retaliation to achieve the same neurochemical satisfaction. People who become habitual revenge seekers develop patterns remarkably similar to substance abusers, needing progressively more extreme actions to generate the neural rewards they experienced from milder retaliation early in their revenge careers. The brain adapts to revenge experiences by reducing sensitivity to dopamine, creating a neurochemical tolerance that drives escalation toward more dangerous and destructive forms of getting even. This explains why conflicts that begin with minor slights can spiral into devastating feuds, where the retaliation becomes completely disproportionate to the original offense. The neural reward system demands increasing doses of revenge to maintain the same level of satisfaction. The withdrawal phase following revenge reveals why retaliation so often fails to provide the lasting satisfaction people expect when they contemplate getting even. Brain scans taken hours or days after successful revenge show decreased activity in reward circuits and increased activation in regions associated with regret, anxiety, and social concern. The neurochemical high of achieved retaliation gives way to a complex mixture of guilt, fear of consequences, and often renewed rumination about whether the revenge was sufficient or appropriate. The dopamine system that created intense pleasure during the anticipation and execution phases becomes depleted, leaving people feeling worse than they did before they got revenge. This creates what researchers call the revenge paradox, where the very action that promised to resolve emotional pain actually generates new forms of psychological distress. The neural aftermath of revenge often includes activation of the default mode network associated with self-reflection and moral evaluation, generating regret and anxiety that can be more psychologically costly than the original injury. Our brains seem designed to enjoy revenge in the moment but suffer for it afterward. The neurochemical mathematics consistently favor forgiveness over retaliation when calculated across longer time horizons. Inhibitory control mechanisms in the prefrontal cortex normally serve as neurological brakes that prevent us from acting on every revenge impulse our limbic systems generate. Brain imaging shows that people with stronger connections between the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and emotional processing centers are significantly less likely to engage in retaliatory behavior even when they experience strong urges for revenge. However, psychological stress, sleep deprivation, alcohol consumption, and emotional overwhelm can all impair these inhibitory systems, making revenge behavior more likely even in people who normally exercise good self-control. The neural balance between impulse and restraint shifts dramatically under conditions of high emotional arousal, explaining why people often act on revenge desires they would normally resist. Studies show that the same individuals who demonstrate excellent impulse control under normal circumstances can become capable of extreme retaliation when their prefrontal regulatory systems are compromised by stress or emotion. The neuroscience reveals that revenge behavior depends not just on the intensity of our anger, but on the current state of our neural self-control systems. Social neuroscience research has identified specific neural mechanisms that make witnessing or hearing about revenge against those who have wronged us nearly as rewarding as getting revenge ourselves. Brain scans of people learning that someone they dislike has suffered misfortune show activation in the same reward circuits that light up during direct retaliation. This phenomenon, sometimes called neural schadenfreude, explains why gossip about the downfall of those who have hurt us feels so satisfying, and why we often feel a sense of cosmic justice when life seems to deliver comeuppance to our enemies. The neural reward system treats vicarious revenge as a legitimate substitute for direct action, providing neurochemical satisfaction from observing others experience consequences for their harmful behavior. This helps explain why revenge stories are so universally popular across cultures, and why we feel genuine pleasure when fictional villains receive their just desserts in movies and literature. Our brains are wired to enjoy justice even when we are not the ones delivering it. The development of revenge-seeking neural patterns appears to be influenced by early childhood experiences with fairness, justice, and retaliation in family and social environments. Neuroimaging studies of adults with histories of childhood trauma or inconsistent discipline show altered activity patterns in revenge-related brain circuits, often with heightened sensitivity to perceived slights and reduced activity in inhibitory control regions. People who grew up in environments where retaliation was normalized, or where injustices were never addressed, develop neural patterns that make revenge-seeking more automatic and less subject to conscious control. Conversely, individuals raised in families that emphasized forgiveness and conflict resolution show stronger connections between emotional processing centers and regulatory brain regions, making them more capable of resisting revenge impulses. The neuroscience suggests that our capacity for revenge or forgiveness is partly shaped by how our brains develop in response to early experiences with justice and retaliation. The neural hardware for emotional regulation can be strengthened or weakened depending on childhood experiences with conflict and resolution. Part 4. Memory as fiction writer. Human memory operates nothing like the video recording system most people imagine, but rather functions as a creative storyteller that continually rewrites our experiences to align with our current emotional needs and evolving understanding of ourselves and others. When it comes to emotional injuries and grudges, our memory systems consistently bias their creative work toward versions that intensify rather than diminish our sense of having been wronged. Each time we recall a hurtful incident, our brains reconstruct the experience from scattered neural fragments, filling in gaps with educated guesses, assumptions and interpretations that reflect our present emotional state rather than objective historical accuracy. This memory reconstruction process systematically inflates emotional debts by making past hurts seem more severe, more intentional, and more personally targeted than they actually were at the time they occurred. Understanding how memory distorts our emotional accounting reveals why grudges often seem to grow stronger over time rather than fading, and why people can develop completely sincere conviction about injustices that bear little resemblance to what external observers witnessed. Our memories are not archives, but active participants in the mathematics of resentment. The reconstruction process begins with what neuroscientists call pattern completion, where our brains fill in missing details based on other similar experiences, cultural expectations, and logical inferences about what probably happened. If someone speaks harshly to us and we cannot remember their exact facial expression, our memory system will likely supply an expression consistent with harsh speech, possibly making them appear more contemptuous or malicious than they actually looked. When we cannot recall the precise tone of voice someone used during a criticism, our brains provide a tone that matches the emotional intensity we currently associate with the incident. These reconstructed details feel completely authentic because they are neurologically indistinguishable from actual memories, but they systematically bias our recollections toward more dramatic and personally hurtful versions of events. The pattern completion process operates like a malicious editor that consistently chooses the most emotionally damaging interpretation of ambiguous evidence. Memory does not just record grudges, but actively amplifies them through creative reconstruction. Emotional state-dependent memory creates additional distortions that make past hurt seem more painful when we recall them during periods of current distress or conflict with the same person. When we are angry with someone in the present, our memory systems preferentially retrieve other occasions when they upset us, and these recalled incidents get contaminated by our current emotional state to seem more severe than they felt originally. A friend's thoughtless comment that barely bothered us at the time can be remembered as deliberately cruel when we recall it during a period of relationship tension. The memory reconstruction process borrows emotional intensity from our current state and retroactively applies it to past events, creating false continuity between present conflicts and historical grievances. This explains why relationship arguments often involve accusations about things that happened months or years earlier, with the injured party expressing levels of hurt that seem disproportionate to how they reacted when the incidents actually occurred. Current anger rewrites the emotional significance of past events to support present grievances. Social memory reconstruction occurs when our recollections of emotional injuries get influenced by conversations with others who were present, sympathetic friends who validate our perspective, or even complete strangers who share similar experiences. When we discuss a hurtful incident with others, their reactions and interpretations become incorporated into our own memory of what happened. A friend who responds to our story with outrage might lead us to remember feeling more outraged ourselves than we actually did at the time. Someone who points out implications we had not considered can cause us to remember being aware of those implications from the beginning. The social sharing of emotional injuries creates collaborative memory reconstruction where multiple people contribute to a version of events that becomes more dramatic and personally meaningful than what any individual actually experienced. Group memory amplifies individual memory distortion through collective storytelling that serves emotional rather than historical accuracy. The availability heuristic causes us to overestimate both the frequency and significance of emotional injuries by making dramatic negative events more memorable and accessible than positive or neutral interactions. When we try to evaluate how someone has treated us over time, our memory systems more easily retrieve occasions when they hurt or disappointed us, because these experiences created stronger neural traces than the countless unremarkable interactions where they were perfectly adequate or even kind. This creates a systematic bias toward remembering relationships as more negative than they actually were, with emotional injuries standing out in sharp relief against a background of forgotten, ordinary moments. The mathematical calculation of emotional debts becomes skewed because our memory provides a biased sample of evidence that overrepresents negative experiences and underrepresents positive ones. Someone who has treated us well 90% of the time might be remembered primarily for the 10% when they fell short of our expectations, simply because those moments created more memorable neural experiences. The availability bias makes emotional accounting inherently unfair by giving disproportionate weight to memorable negative events. Hindsight bias systematically distorts our memory of emotional injuries by making harmful intentions seem more obvious and predictable than they actually were at the time. When someone eventually reveals themselves to be untrustworthy or cruel, our memory systems retroactively edit earlier interactions to include warning signs and red flags that we now convince ourselves were clearly visible from the beginning. A betrayal that genuinely surprised us gets remembered as the inevitable conclusion of a pattern we claim we always suspected. This hindsight reconstruction serves our psychological need to believe we are better at detecting deception and predicting human behavior than we actually are, but it also inflates the emotional debt by making past injuries seem more deliberately calculated and personally targeted. Someone who hurt us through genuine thoughtlessness gets remembered as having planned our suffering from the beginning, transforming accidents into malicious attacks through the alchemy of hindsight bias. Memory protects our ego by rewriting history to make us seem more perceptive than we were. But this psychological protection comes at the cost of fair accounting for others' intentions and actions. Peak end rule distortion causes us to remember emotional experiences based primarily on their most intense moments and how they concluded, rather than their overall duration or average intensity. A relationship that included many positive interactions but ended badly gets remembered primarily for its worst moments and bitter conclusion. A friendship that lasted years gets psychologically reduced to the fight that ended it, with our memory systems focusing on peak moments of hurt and anger while discounting the accumulated positive experiences that preceded the final conflict. This creates profoundly unfair emotional accounting, where years of kindness and support get outweighed by days or even hours of conflict simply because peak emotions and endings carried disproportionate psychological weight. The peak end rule explains why former friends can speak about each other with such bitterness despite having shared genuine affection for extended periods, and why people often feel that discovering someone's character flaws retroactively ruins all their previous positive experiences with that person. Memory mathematics consistently overweight dramatic endings at the expense of ordinary middle chapters. Motivated reasoning creates systematic memory distortions where our recollections gradually shift to support conclusions we have already reached about someone's character or our relationship with them. If we decide that someone does not truly care about us, our memory systems begin preferentially retrieving evidence that supports this conclusion while suppressing or reinterpreting contrary evidence. Acts of genuine kindness get remembered as manipulative attempts to assuage guilt or maintain appearances. Expressions of concern get reframed as intrusive boundary violations. Generous gestures get recalled as calculated attempts to create obligation or control our behavior. The memory reconstruction process serves our current emotional narrative by selectively editing past experiences to create coherent but often inaccurate stories about patterns of mistreatment or neglect. Motivated reasoning transforms memory from a historical record into a psychological advocacy system that builds the strongest possible case for whatever we currently want to believe about others and ourselves. Our memories become lawyers, arguing for predetermined conclusions rather than witnesses testifying about actual events. Part 5. The Theatre of Revenge Fantasies. The human imagination serves as a private theatre where we rehearse elaborate revenge scenarios with the obsessive dedication of method actors preparing for the performance of a lifetime. These mental productions feature ourselves as the wronged protagonist seeking righteous justice, complete with detailed scripts for how we will confront our enemies, devastating dialogue we will deliver to expose their hypocrisy, and satisfying conclusions where they suffer appropriate consequences for their crimes against us. Revenge fantasies operate as both psychological pressure, release valves, and neurochemical reward systems, providing immediate gratification for our desire for justice while simultaneously reinforcing and intensifying our emotional investment in past grievances. The quality and sophistication of these imaginary revenge scenarios often far exceed anything we could realistically implement, creating expectations for dramatic satisfaction that real-world retaliation almost never fulfills. Understanding the psychology of revenge fantasies reveals how our imagination both helps us cope with emotional injuries and traps us in cycles of resentment that can dominate our mental life for months or years after the original offence occurred. The theatre of the mind becomes both sanctuary and prison for those carrying emotional debts they cannot forgive. The production values of revenge fantasies typically escalate dramatically over time, as our imagination refines and elaborates scenarios through countless mental rehearsals. What begins as simple daydreams about telling someone exactly what we think of them gradually develop into complex narratives featuring multiple acts, supporting characters, and increasingly creative forms of poetic justice. We might start by imagining a straightforward confrontation where we finally speak our truth to someone who hurt us. Over weeks or months of mental revision, this simple scene transforms into an elaborate production where our eloquent speech leaves them speechless with shame. Witnesses validate our position. Authority figures take our side, and consequences cascade through their life in ways that mirror the impact their actions had on ours. The fantasy develops supporting characters who serve as Greek chorus, validating our perspective, plot devices that ensure perfect timing for maximum dramatic impact, and resolution sequences where justice unfolds with the satisfying inevitability of a well-constructed narrative. Our imagination becomes a screenwriter, working obsessively on a script where we finally win decisively against those who have wronged us. Revenge fantasies often feature what psychologists call the omniscience illusion, where we imagine having perfect knowledge of our enemy's motivations, fears, and vulnerabilities that we can exploit for maximum psychological impact. In our mental scenarios, we deliver precisely the words that will devastate them most completely, expose their deepest insecurities, and reveal truths about their character that they have been hiding from themselves and others. We fantasize about having supernatural insight into their psychology that allows us to craft retaliation with surgical precision, hitting emotional targets that will cause them to experience exactly the type of pain they inflicted on us. These omniscience fantasies reflect our desperate desire to understand why people hurt us, and our frustrated inability to achieve the kind of perfect knowledge that would allow us to respond with devastating effectiveness. The imaginary revenge scenarios compensate for our real-world confusion and powerlessness by granting us godlike understanding of human nature and perfect timing in deploying our insights for maximum retaliatory impact. Fantasy omniscience becomes emotional comfort food for those who feel they have been outsmarted or manipulated by others. The audience dynamics of revenge fantasies reveal deep psychological needs for validation and social support that the original injury may have threatened or undermined. Our imaginary revenge scenarios almost always include witnesses who observe our triumph and validate that we were right to feel wronged, that our retaliation is justified, and that our enemy deserved whatever consequences they received. These fantasy audiences serve multiple psychological functions simultaneously, providing the social confirmation we may have lacked when the original injury occurred, demonstrating that reasonable people would support our position and ensuring that our vindication is public rather than private. The witnesses in our revenge fantasies often include people whose opinions matter to us in real life, authority figures who can provide official validation of our grievances, and sometimes the very people who failed to support us when we actually needed their help. Through fantasy audiences, we retroactively obtain the social backing that would have changed the original power dynamics and prevented us from feeling so isolated in our hurt. The imaginary validation compensates for real-world experiences of being dismissed, misunderstood, or blamed for situations where we genuinely were victimized. Revenge fantasies frequently include elaborate scenes of confession and acknowledgement where our enemies finally admit their wrongdoing, express genuine remorse, and acknowledge the full extent of the damage they caused. These imaginary apology sequences often feature more emotional honesty and personal insight than most people are capable of expressing in real life, with our fantasy enemies demonstrating perfect understanding of how their actions affected us and accepting complete responsibility without defensiveness or excuse-making. The confession scenes serve our deep psychological need to have our pain recognized and validated by the very people who caused it, transforming them from adversaries into witnesses who verify that our suffering was real and our anger justified. In these fantasies, the people who hurt us become the ultimate validators of our emotional experience, providing acknowledgement that we could never extract from them in reality. The imaginary confessions offer perfect closure that real relationships almost never provide, where complex interpersonal conflicts get resolved through complete admission of fault and perfectly articulated understanding of harm caused. Fantasy apologies become emotional settlements that our real-world adversaries would never agree to pay. The consequences phase of revenge fantasies typically features forms of poetic justice where our enemies experience setbacks that mirror the impact their actions had on our lives. If someone damaged our reputation, we imagine scenarios where their own credibility gets destroyed through exposure of their hypocrisy or incompetence. If someone betrayed our trust, we fantasize about them being abandoned by people they depend on when they most need support. If someone humiliated us publicly, we envision their own public embarrassment under circumstances that demonstrate their character flaws to everyone who once respected them. These poetic justice sequences reflect our deep desire for moral equilibrium in a universe that often seems to reward bad behavior and punish virtue. The fantasy consequences restore cosmic balance by ensuring that harmful actions eventually generate proportionate suffering for those who commit them, even when real-world justice systems fail to provide appropriate accountability. Through imaginary poetic justice, we temporarily repair our faith in fairness and moral order that the original injury may have damaged. Revenge fantasies become our private justice system, operating by rules that make more sense than the random unfairness of actual life. The resolution sequences of elaborate revenge fantasies often feature our own magnanimous response to our enemy's downfall, where we demonstrate superior character by offering forgiveness or mercy after they have suffered appropriate consequences. These fantasy conclusions allow us to simultaneously satisfy our desire for retaliation and maintain our self-image as fundamentally decent people who are capable of rising above petty vindictiveness. We imagine graciously accepting their apologies, choosing not to pursue additional punishment, despite having the power to do so, and perhaps even offering help to rebuild what their own poor choices destroyed. The magnanimous resolution serves multiple psychological functions by proving our moral superiority, demonstrating that we are bigger people than our enemies, and showing that we were motivated by justice rather than mere vindictiveness. Through fantasy magnanimity, we get to experience both the satisfaction of comprehensive victory and the moral glow of merciful restraint, achieving emotional outcomes that would be impossible to obtain simultaneously in real-world conflicts. The imaginary high road becomes the final proof of our essential goodness despite our extensive investment in elaborate revenge scenarios. The addictive quality of revenge fantasies stems from their ability to provide immediate neurochemical rewards while requiring no real-world risks or ethical compromises. Mental rehearsals of retaliation activate the same dopamine reward circuits as actual revenge, but without the potential consequences that make real retaliation dangerous or morally problematic. We can experience the satisfaction of perfect justice without hurting anyone, the validation of public vindication without actual confrontation, and the restoration of power without engaging in behavior that might later cause guilt or regret. Revenge fantasies become the ideal drug for wounded egos, providing pure emotional gratification without side effects or withdrawal symptoms. However, this very safety and convenience can make fantasy revenge more psychologically compelling than real-world resolution, trapping us in imaginary theatres where we replay perfect victories instead of engaging in the messy work of actual relationship repair or genuine closure. The theatre of revenge becomes so satisfying that we lose interest in the compromised and complicated solutions that real life typically offers for interpersonal conflicts. Part 6. The Chemistry of Justice. The neurochemical systems that govern our responses to fairness and injustice operate with the precision of a complex pharmaceutical laboratory, manufacturing and distributing specific molecular cocktails that determine whether we feel satisfied with outcomes or driven to seek further retaliation. Dopamine and serotonin, the two major neurotransmitters involved in reward processing and mood regulation, respond to experiences of justice and revenge in sophisticated patterns that reveal why certain types of resolution feel deeply satisfying, while others leave us craving additional action. Recent neuroscientific research has discovered that these chemical systems work in opposition to each other during moral decision-making, creating internal conflicts between immediate gratification and long-term well-being that help explain why revenge feels so appealing in the moment but often produces regret and continued dissatisfaction afterward. Understanding the chemistry of justice reveals that our emotional responses to fairness and retaliation are not abstract moral judgments, but concrete biochemical reactions that follow predictable patterns and can be influenced by both psychological and pharmaceutical interventions. Dopamine functions as the primary reward chemical for experiences of justice and successful retaliation, flooding our neural reward circuits when we perceive that wrongs have been corrected or that we have successfully defended our interests against those who would harm us. Brain imaging studies show that dopamine levels surge most dramatically not when justice is actually achieved, but when we first anticipate that appropriate consequences might befall those who have wronged us. This anticipatory dopamine release explains why we can feel intensely satisfied by early signs that our enemies might face setbacks even before any actual consequences occur. The neurochemical reward system treats the possibility of justice as if it were already happening, providing immediate gratification that reinforces our continued investment in hoping for or planning retaliation. Dopamine essentially functions as a chemical betting system that rewards us for investing mental and emotional energy in scenarios where we might eventually achieve satisfaction through others' suffering or acknowledgement of our grievances. The neurotransmitter makes revenge-seeking feel intrinsically rewarding by providing chemical payoffs for simply contemplating retaliation. The dopamine response to actual revenge follows a characteristic pattern of intense initial satisfaction followed by rapid habituation that mirrors the neurochemical progression of substance addiction. When people first experience successful retaliation against those who have wronged them, brain scans show massive dopamine spikes that create genuine euphoria and a profound sense of restored equilibrium. However, subsequent acts of revenge against the same person or similar offences produce progressively smaller neurochemical responses, requiring escalation in severity or creativity to achieve the same level of satisfaction. The dopamine system adapts to revenge experiences by developing tolerance, creating a neurochemical imperative for increasingly dramatic forms of retaliation to maintain the same level of reward. This explains why conflicts often spiral into violence that seems completely disproportionate to the original grievance, with each side requiring more extreme actions to satisfy dopamine systems that have become desensitized to milder forms of retaliation. The chemistry of revenge creates an addiction model where tolerance demands escalation regardless of rational cost-benefit analysis or moral considerations. Serotonin operates as a chemical brake system that promotes long-term thinking, social cooperation, and consideration of consequences that extend beyond immediate personal gratification. While dopamine rewards us for achieving short-term victories over our enemies, serotonin creates satisfaction from outcomes that benefit everyone involved and promote stable social relationships over extended time periods. Neurochemical studies reveal that serotonin and dopamine often work in direct opposition during moral decision-making, with dopamine pushing for immediate retaliation while serotonin generates discomfort about potential negative consequences of revenge. People with naturally higher serotonin activity show greater capacity for forgiveness and more concern about how their actions might affect others, while those with dominant dopamine systems are more likely to pursue immediate gratification through retaliation. The chemical balance between these neurotransmitter systems partly determines whether individuals will prioritize short-term satisfaction from revenge or long-term benefits from forgiveness and reconciliation. Brain chemistry influences moral decision-making in ways that most people never consciously recognize. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline create additional chemical complexity by amplifying both the intensity of revenge desires and the potential regret that follows retaliatory actions. When we are emotionally activated by injustice or threat, our stress response systems flood the brain with chemicals that enhance focus and energy while simultaneously impairing judgment and long-term thinking. Elevated cortisol makes perceived slights feel more threatening and urgent, increasing the neurochemical rewards associated with defensive or retaliatory responses. However, chronic stress also depletes the neurotransmitter systems responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning, making us more likely to act on revenge impulses we would normally resist. The stress chemistry of ongoing conflict creates a vicious cycle where unresolved grievances generate chronic elevation of hormones that make resolution more difficult by impairing the very brain systems needed for forgiveness and perspective-taking. Stress chemicals make revenge feel more necessary while simultaneously undermining our capacity for the complex thinking required to break cycles of retaliation. Oxytocin and vasopressin, often called the social bonding chemicals, play crucial roles in determining whether we extend empathy and consideration to those who have wronged us, or whether we dehumanize them sufficiently to justify harsh retaliation. These neurochemicals promote trust, cooperation, and emotional connection within our identified social groups, while simultaneously making us more suspicious and aggressive toward perceived outsiders or enemies. When someone hurts us, our brain chemistry often shifts to recategorize them from ally to threat, reducing oxytocin responses that would normally promote empathy while increasing vasopressin activity that enhances territorial and defensive behaviors. This chemical recategorization makes revenge feel more justified by reducing our natural inhibitions against harming others and increasing our focus on group loyalty and protection. The social bonding chemicals create neurochemical permission for retaliation by chemically reclassifying our enemies as outside the circle of moral consideration that normally constrains our behavior toward fellow human beings. Brain chemistry can literally change how we categorize others' humanity when calculating the ethics of revenge. Endorphins and endocannabinoids provide additional chemical rewards for successful revenge that help explain why retaliation can feel not just satisfying but genuinely healing for people who have been significantly wronged. These natural opioid systems activate during experiences of restored justice and social vindication, creating genuine relief from emotional pain that can make revenge feel like effective medicine for psychological wounds. Brain scans of people who have achieved satisfying retaliation show activation of the same pain relief systems that respond to morphine and other opioid drugs, suggesting that revenge literally functions as natural pain medication for certain types of emotional injury. The endorphin response to justice helps explain why forgiveness can feel so difficult for people carrying significant emotional wounds, since it requires giving up a neurochemical pain relief system that provides genuine comfort. Understanding revenge as a form of self-medication reveals why purely moral arguments for forgiveness often fail to persuade people who are experiencing real neurochemical benefits from their resentment and retaliation planning. The brain chemistry of revenge serves legitimate pain management functions that purely cognitive approaches to conflict resolution often ignore. Gamma-aminobutyric acid, commonly known as GABA, serves as the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter and plays a crucial role in regulating the intensity and duration of revenge-related emotions and impulses. People with naturally higher GABA activity show greater capacity to calm themselves after experiencing injustice and are less likely to ruminate obsessively about perceived wrongs. Conversely, individuals with GABA deficiencies often struggle with persistent anger, intrusive thoughts about revenge, and difficulty letting go of grievances even when they intellectually recognize that continued resentment is harmful. This chemical system explains why some people seem naturally more forgiving, while others appear constitutionally incapable of moving past emotional injuries. GABA function can be enhanced through meditation, exercise, certain medications, and specific therapeutic interventions, suggesting that the capacity for forgiveness might be partly trainable through practices that influence brain chemistry. The neurochemical basis of grudge holding offers hope that people who struggle with persistent resentment might be able to develop greater emotional flexibility through interventions that target their underlying brain chemistry, rather than relying solely on willpower and moral reasoning. Part 7. Nietzsche's Mathematics of Resentment. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of resentment represents perhaps the most sophisticated analysis ever developed of how individual emotional injuries transform into comprehensive philosophical systems that reshape entire cultures' understanding of good and evil. Unlike simple anger that seeks immediate resolution through direct action, Resentment emerges when people are too weak, powerless, or constrained to retaliate against those who harm them, forcing them to develop elaborate internal accounting systems that revalue their inability to strike back as moral superiority. Nietzsche recognized that resentment operates as a form of creative mathematics, where the powerless recalculate the entire moral universe to transform their weakness into virtue and their enemy's strength into vice. This psychological alchemy converts frustrated revenge impulses into moral frameworks that can persist for centuries, influencing literature, politics, religion, and social movements long after the original injuries that sparked them have been forgotten. Understanding Nietzschean resentment reveals how personal grudges can evolve into cultural institutions and why certain forms of moral outrage contain hidden mathematics of unresolved emotional debt that continue compounding across generations. The philosophy of resentment exposes the bookkeeping behind some of humanity's most cherished values. The transformation from immediate anger to systematic resentment begins when direct retaliation becomes impossible due to power imbalances, social constraints, or practical limitations that prevent the injured party from striking back proportionately. When a slave cannot physically resist a master's cruelty, when a worker cannot challenge an abusive boss without losing employment, when a child cannot fight back against parental injustice, the natural impulse for revenge gets redirected into internal psychological processes that seek satisfaction through reinterpretation rather than action. Nietzsche observed that this redirection creates a fundamental split between external powerlessness and internal authority, where people who cannot control their circumstances claim superior understanding of moral truth. The inability to achieve justice through force becomes reframed as the moral wisdom to transcend force entirely. Resentment mathematics transforms practical weakness into ethical superiority by recalculating the entire value system that originally defined strength and weakness, success and failure, winner and loser. The powerless become the morally powerful through philosophical alchemy that inverts conventional hierarchies. The creative phase of resentment involves what Nietzsche called the fabrication of ideals, where frustrated revenge impulses generate entirely new value systems that condemn the very qualities and behaviours that the resentful person cannot successfully embody or achieve. If physical strength and dominance are beyond reach, resentment mathematics recalculates them as morally inferior to gentleness and submission. If wealth and material success seem unattainable, they get redefined as spiritual corruption that prevents access to higher forms of fulfillment. If social confidence and charisma feel impossible to develop, they become reinterpreted as superficial vanity that distracts from deeper authenticity. The resentment process systematically inverts every value system that makes the resentful person feel inadequate, creating comprehensive moral frameworks where their limitations become virtues and their enemies' advantages become sins. This is not conscious deception, but genuine belief formation where emotional necessity drives intellectual conviction. The mathematics of resentment make failure feel like chosen wisdom rather than imposed limitation. Sour grapes become the sweetest fruit through sufficient philosophical processing. Nietzsche identified Christianity as history's most successful example of resentment mathematics, transforming local grievances into universal moral systems that reshape entire civilizations' understanding of virtue and vice. The early Christian emphasis on loving enemies, turning the other cheek and finding blessedness in poverty, emerged from communities that lacked the power to resist Roman oppression through conventional means. Unable to achieve justice through strength, wealth, or political influence, these communities developed theological mathematics that recalculated worldly success as spiritual failure and earthly suffering as divine favor. The powerless became the chosen people through religious accounting that transformed their disadvantages into evidence of God's special regard. Nietzsche argued that this represents resentiment's masterpiece of creative bookkeeping, where an entire species' moral instincts get redirected toward valuing precisely those qualities that the strong naturally despise or ignore. The meek inherit the earth not through political revolution, but through successful marketing of weakness as the highest spiritual achievement. Christian resentiment mathematics proved so effective that they eventually conquered the very Roman Empire that originally oppressed their creators. The emotional accounting of the powerless became the moral foundation of Western civilization. The psychological mechanism that Nietzsche called the ascetic ideal represents resentiment's most sophisticated form of internal revenge against life itself, when no external targets remain available for retaliation. When people cannot successfully blame others for their suffering, resentiment mathematics can redirect toward existence itself, treating life's inevitable pain and limitation as evidence that reality is fundamentally flawed, and that true value lies in transcending rather than embracing human experience. The ascetic ideal transforms biological drives, natural desires, and worldly engagement into spiritual liabilities that prevent access to higher forms of fulfillment available only through systematic denial of human nature. This represents the ultimate resentment calculation where life itself becomes the enemy, and self-denial becomes the weapon for achieving victory over existence's inherent unfairness. Nietzsche saw this as the most dangerous form of emotional mathematics because it systematically undermines the psychological foundations needed for human flourishing while presenting self-destruction as the path to transcendence. Ascetic resentment makes suffering into virtue and vitality into vice through accounting systems that treat life as the ultimate creditor, whose debts can only be paid through systematic self-denial. The social propagation of resentment occurs when individual emotional accounting systems prove psychologically useful to others who share similar feelings of powerlessness or inadequacy relative to dominant social groups. Personal grudges become collective movements when enough people recognize their own emotional mathematics reflected in someone else's moral framework. The resentful individual's creative revaluation of conventional success provides comfort and direction for others who struggle with similar feelings of inadequacy or injustice. Social movements often begin with one person's sophisticated resentment mathematics that offers emotionally satisfying explanations for why conventional measures of achievement and happiness are spiritually bankrupt. The personal becomes political when individual emotional accounting resonates with broader cultural anxieties about power, worth, and the meaning of success. Nietzsche recognized that resentment's greatest power lies not in individual psychology, but in its capacity to reshape entire societies' moral instincts through emotional mathematics that prove contagious across generations. The bookkeeping of the wounded becomes the conscience of civilization when enough people find comfort in moral systems that validate their limitations as virtues. Individual grudges become cultural values through the democracy of shared inadequacy. The paradox of resentment lies in its simultaneous psychological necessity and life-denying consequences for both individuals and cultures that embrace its moral mathematics too completely. While resentment provides genuine comfort and meaning for people who cannot achieve conventional forms of success or power, It also systematically undermines the very life instincts needed for creative achievement, joy, and genuine human flourishing. The emotional accounting systems that make failure bearable also make success suspicious, creating cultures that excel at critique and moral judgment, while struggling to generate new forms of beauty, achievement, or positive vision. Nietzsche argued that ressentiment mathematics ultimately create societies of sophisticated observers and critics who lack the naive enthusiasm and unreflective confidence needed for great cultural creation. The psychological tools that protect the wounded from despair also protect them from the risks and vulnerabilities that generate genuine accomplishment and artistic achievement. Ressentiment's emotional mathematics solve the problem of suffering, but create new problems of stagnation and creative sterility that may prove even more life-denying than the original injuries that sparked the resentful accounting. The cure for emotional pain becomes a different form of spiritual death through systematic suspicion of life's possibilities. Understanding this paradox reveals why forgiveness might be not just morally superior, but practically necessary for cultures that want to remain capable of affirmation and creation rather than merely criticism and preservation. Part 8. Game Theory and the Economics of Forgiveness. Mathematical game theory reveals that forgiveness operates not as emotional weakness or moral idealism, but as a sophisticated strategy that consistently produces superior outcomes when interactions are repeated over time and reputation matters for future success. The mathematics of cooperation demonstrate that individuals and groups who can strategically combine appropriate retaliation with timely forgiveness outperform both unconditional pacifists and persistent aggressors in virtually every scenario that models real-world social dynamics. Robert Axelrod's famous computer tournaments established that the most successful approach to repeated conflicts follows a simple but powerful formula. Start by cooperating, respond proportionately to betrayal, but quickly return to cooperation when others demonstrate willingness to change their behavior. This mathematical insight transforms forgiveness from a purely moral question into a practical optimization problem, where the goal is maximizing long-term benefits for all parties rather than achieving short-term victories that might prove costly over extended time horizons. Understanding the game theory of forgiveness reveals why mercy often serves self-interest better than revenge, and why the mathematics of cooperation favor those who can strategically balance firmness with flexibility. The equations of human interaction reward neither doormats nor tyrants, but those who master the economics of proportional response and strategic reconciliation. The foundational insight of cooperation game theory emerges from analyzing what happens when the same individuals must interact repeatedly over extended periods, rather than meeting only once with no expectation of future encounters. In single interactions, mathematical analysis suggests that betrayal and exploitation often provide the highest immediate payoffs, since there are no future consequences to consider. However, when relationships involve ongoing interaction, the mathematics shift dramatically to favor strategies that build trust and encourage cooperation, because the long-term benefits of mutual support far exceed whatever can be gained through one-time exploitation. This mathematical principle explains why forgiveness becomes strategically valuable in marriages, friendships, family relationships, business partnerships, and international diplomacy, where parties must continue working together despite periodic conflicts. Game theory reveals that forgiveness is not altruistic sacrifice, but enlightened self-interest that recognizes how short-term generosity creates long-term advantages through enhanced cooperation and reduced conflict costs. The mathematics of repeated interaction make mercy profitable and revenge expensive when calculated across realistic time horizons. The famous tit-for-tat strategy that dominated Axelrod's tournaments demonstrates how simple rules can produce sophisticated outcomes that balance cooperation with self-protection in ways that encourage good behavior while discouraging exploitation. Tit-for-tat begins every relationship by offering cooperation, immediately punishes any betrayal with proportional retaliation, but instantly forgives and returns to cooperation as soon as the other party demonstrates willingness to cooperate again. This strategy proves mathematically superior because it is simultaneously nice, retaliatory, forgiving, and clear in ways that optimize long-term outcomes for everyone involved. The niceness component builds trust and encourages cooperation by signaling good intentions and willingness to create mutual benefits. The retaliatory component prevents exploitation by ensuring that harmful behavior receives immediate consequences that make betrayal unprofitable. The forgiveness component breaks cycles of revenge that would otherwise destroy the relationship's potential for future cooperation. The clarity component makes the strategy predictable and understandable so others can learn to cooperate effectively rather than struggling to decode mysterious or inconsistent responses. Mathematical analysis reveals that this combination of traits consistently outperforms pure aggression, pure pacifism, or complex strategies that try to be too clever for their own good. Generous tit-for-tat represents an evolutionary improvement that adds probabilistic forgiveness to handle the inevitable mistakes and misunderstandings that occur in real-world interactions where perfect information and flawless communication are impossible. This strategy operates like standard tit-for-tat, but occasionally chooses cooperation even when the other party has defected, creating opportunities to break cycles of mutual retaliation that might have started through miscommunication rather than genuine ill intent. The mathematical elegance of generous tit-for-tat lies in its recognition that some proportion of conflicts result from error rather than malice, and that rigid retaliation policies can trap both parties in destructive cycles that serve no one's interests. By building in calculated mercy, this strategy maintains the benefits of proportional response while creating escape hatches that allow relationships to recover from temporary breakdowns in cooperation. The generosity component functions as insurance against the inevitable misunderstandings that would otherwise escalate into permanent feuds between parties who share fundamental interests in maintaining cooperative relationships. Game theory mathematics demonstrate that strategic forgiveness actually strengthens rather than weakens the credibility of deterrent threats by showing that retaliation serves specific purposes rather than reflecting unchangeable hostility. Win-stay, lose-shift strategies reveal additional mathematical insights about when forgiveness serves strategic purposes and when persistence in current approaches produces better outcomes. These strategies maintain current behavior patterns when they are producing satisfactory results, but shift approaches when outcomes become unsatisfactory, creating adaptive responses that adjust tactics based on empirical feedback rather than predetermined rules. Applied to forgiveness decisions, win-stay, lose-shift mathematics suggest continuing current approaches to conflict resolution as long as they generate acceptable outcomes, but shifting toward either more or less forgiving strategies when relationships deteriorate or when excessive mercy enables exploitation. This mathematical framework transforms forgiveness from a binary choice into a continuous optimization problem where the goal is calibrating responses to produce the best available outcomes given current circumstances and future expectations. The strategy recognizes that optimal levels of forgiveness vary depending on the specific individuals involved, the nature of their relationship, the costs of ongoing conflict, and the probability that mercy will generate genuine behavior change rather than merely encouraging further exploitation. Game theory. Mathematics support neither unconditional forgiveness nor permanent retaliation, but rather adaptive approaches that adjust mercy levels based on empirical evidence about what actually works with particular people in specific situations. The economics of reputation in repeated games demonstrate why forgiveness can serve strategic purposes, even when direct benefits to the relationship are minimal or non-existent. In social environments where information about how people treat others circulates among potential future partners, being known as someone who can forgive and reconcile becomes a valuable asset that attracts cooperators while deterring exploiters who prefer targets unlikely to retaliate effectively. Mathematical models show that individuals with reputations for strategic forgiveness often receive preferential treatment from others who recognize their capacity for both punishment and mercy as signs of strength rather than weakness. The reputation for proportional response, followed by strategic reconciliation, signals sophisticated understanding of cooperation dynamics that makes others more willing to invest in long-term relationships and less likely to attempt exploitation. Game theory reveals that forgiveness can function as costly signaling that demonstrates confidence, security, and long-term thinking in ways that enhance social status and create opportunities for beneficial partnerships. The mathematics of reputation make mercy profitable even in relationships that may never recover because other observers draw positive conclusions about character and judgment that influence future interactions. Evolutionary game theory extends these insights to show how forgiveness strategies can dominate aggressive approaches even when forgiving individuals occasionally suffer exploitation in the short term. Mathematical simulations reveal that populations containing strategic forgivers tend to evolve higher levels of overall cooperation and prosperity than populations dominated by purely retaliatory strategies, even though forgivers sometimes lose individual encounters with exploiters. The group-level benefits of forgiveness arise because strategic mercy creates environments where cooperation becomes the dominant strategy for most individuals, reducing overall conflict costs and creating more resources available for productive rather than defensive activities. Populations with sophisticated forgiveness strategies spend less energy on endless cycles of retaliation and more energy on activities that generate genuine value for everyone involved. Evolutionary mathematics demonstrate that forgiveness serves not just individual strategic purposes, but also collective interests, by creating social environments where cooperation thrives and exploitation becomes increasingly unprofitable as a lifestyle strategy. The game theory of forgiveness reveals that mercy is not naive idealism, but sophisticated realism about what social strategies actually work when calculated across realistic timeframes and population dynamics. Mathematical analysis consistently supports the counterintuitive conclusion that strategic forgiveness often serves self-interest better than persistent revenge, while simultaneously creating better outcomes for everyone else involved. The economics of cooperation make mercy profitable and grudges expensive when properly calculated. Part 9. The generational compound interest of family feuds. Family feuds represent the most devastating examples of how emotional debts can compound across generations, transforming individual grievances into inherited liabilities that continue accumulating interest long after the original debtors and creditors have died. Unlike conflicts between unrelated individuals that typically end when the parties separate or pass away, family feuds create permanent emotional account balances that get transferred to children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who inherit both the resentments and the obligation to continue collecting on debts they did not incur. The mathematics of generational resentment follow principles of compound interest that would make financial advisors weep, where modest initial injuries grow into comprehensive hatred that can destroy family systems for decades or centuries through accumulated psychological interest that exceeds any rational calculation of the original harm. Understanding how family feuds operate reveals the most destructive potential of human emotional accounting systems and demonstrates why forgiveness becomes not just morally important, but practically essential for preventing minor conflicts from consuming entire family lineages. The compound interest of inherited grudges represents perhaps the most expensive emotional mathematics in human experience. Some debts are too costly to collect, even when they are entirely legitimate. The initiation phase of family feuds typically begins with what would be considered relatively minor conflicts in other contexts, but the unique psychological dynamics of family relationships create emotional valuations that transform ordinary disagreements into existential threats requiring permanent retaliation. A business dispute between brothers carries exponentially higher emotional weight than the same conflict between unrelated partners because family relationships involve expectations of loyalty, trust, and mutual support that business relationships do not require. When these elevated expectations get violated, the emotional accounting system calculates not just the immediate practical harm, but the betrayal of fundamental family obligations that were supposed to transcend ordinary self-interest. The injury includes not only what was done, but what it reveals about the offender's true feelings toward family bonds that the victim assumed were sacred and unbreakable. A family member who chooses personal advantage over family welfare commits a category of offence that has no equivalent in non-family relationships, creating emotional debts that seem to require permanent collection efforts to restore the moral order that the betrayal disrupted. Family feuds begin when someone violates the special mathematics that govern family loyalty and discovers that ordinary conflict resolution methods cannot address the unique psychological injuries involved. The inheritance mechanism that perpetuates family feuds across generations operates through psychological transmission of emotional accounts that children absorb through family stories, unexplained tensions, and subtle loyalties that shape their understanding of family history and their obligations to previous generations. Children growing up in feuding families receive partial and biased information about historical conflicts that presents their side as innocent victims and the other side as villains whose behaviour justified permanent estrangement. These simplified narratives serve important psychological functions by providing clear moral frameworks and strong group identity, but they also inherit the emotional mathematics of previous generations without the contextual information needed to evaluate whether continued resentment serves any constructive purpose. Children become stakeholders in conflicts they do not fully understand, carrying forward grudges based on incomplete information that gets further distorted through each retelling. The inherited emotional accounts accumulate additional layers of interpretation and resentment as new generations add their own feelings about being dragged into conflicts that preceded their birth but continue affecting their family relationships and social opportunities. Generational transmission transforms historical grievances into current identity markers that define who belongs to which side of ongoing family warfare. The famous Hatfield and McCoy feud demonstrates how initial incidents that might have been resolved through direct communication can escalate into multi-generational warfare that eventually consumes entire family systems and destroys hundreds of lives through accumulated psychological interest. The conflict began with Civil War loyalties and a disputed pig, but grew into a comprehensive blood feud that killed at least 13 people and terrorized entire communities for more than 3 decades. Each act of retaliation created new emotional debts that required additional collection efforts, with the mathematical logic of revenge demanding that each response exceed the previous offense to adequately restore family honor and deter future attacks. The escalation pattern followed compound interest principles, where initial modest injuries grew into devastating violence as each generation calculated that insufficient retaliation would invite additional aggression and signal weakness that encouraged further victimization. The emotional mathematics became so complex that family members on both sides lost track of the original grievances while continuing to accumulate new reasons for hatred based on recent violence that seemed to justify whatever historical animosity had preceded it. The feud developed its own momentum, where current injuries provided sufficient justification for continued warfare regardless of whether anyone could remember or explain the initial causes. Business-family feuds reveal how financial disagreements can transform into comprehensive emotional warfare that destroys both family relationships and the enterprises that initially created wealth for everyone involved. The Gucci family empire collapsed, partly because sibling rivalry and generational conflicts created emotional accounting systems that prioritized settling family scores over maintaining the business success that provided the foundation for their wealth and status. When family members begin calculating emotional debts and credits based on perceived unfairness in business roles, compensation, recognition, or succession planning, the resulting resentments can make rational business decisions impossible because every choice gets evaluated primarily for its impact on family power dynamics rather than business performance. The emotional mathematics of family business conflicts often follow zero-sum logic, where one person's success automatically represents another person's failure, making collaboration and compromise feel like surrender rather than sensible business strategy. Family members can become so invested in proving they were right about historical disputes that they willingly destroy the business, rather than accept outcomes that might validate their opponent's positions or suggest that their grievances were not entirely justified. The compound interest of family business resentment can make economic suicide feel like moral victory when preserving family honor becomes more important than preserving family wealth. Modern family feuds often involve inheritance disputes that reveal how death can serve as the ultimate audit of family emotional accounting systems, forcing final calculations of who deserves what, based on decades of accumulated debts and credits in relationships where love, duty, and financial support became impossibly intertwined. Estate planning becomes emotionally explosive when it requires explicit quantification of relative family value through asset distribution that will be interpreted as final judgment about which relationships were most important and which family members proved most worthy of continued support. Parents often struggle with inheritance decisions because any choice other than perfect equality will be seen as validation of some family members' accusations about favoritism, while contradicting others' assumptions about their special status or contributions. The inheritance process forces families to confront accumulated emotional accounts that may have remained implicit for decades, creating opportunities for resentments to explode into permanent estrangement when the will reading reveals calculations that different family members find unacceptable. Inheritance feuds represent the final compound interest calculation, where lifetime emotional debts get settled through financial distributions that often satisfy no one and create new grievances that the deceased parent cannot address or mediate. Death transforms family emotional accounting from ongoing negotiation into permanent judgment that locks in final calculations regardless of whether they accurately reflect the deceased person's intentions or feelings. The resolution of family feuds typically requires someone to voluntarily absorb losses that exceed their fair share of responsibility for historical conflicts, accepting emotional and often financial costs to break cycles of retaliation that have become more expensive than the original injuries that started them. Successful family reconciliation usually involves at least one party deciding that continued warfare costs more than accepting imperfect justice and moving forward with whatever relationship remains possible. This decision often requires sophisticated emotional mathematics that calculates the benefits of restored family connection against the psychological costs of letting go of legitimate grievances that may never receive adequate acknowledgement or compensation. The person who chooses reconciliation must essentially forgive compound interest as well as principal debt, accepting that they will never recover the full emotional costs of the conflict, while also giving up the psychological benefits they may have gained from maintaining victim status and moral superiority. Family feud resolution represents one of the most expensive forms of forgiveness because it typically requires abandoning years or decades of emotional investment in being right about historical conflicts. The mathematics of family reconciliation rarely involve equal sacrifice from all parties, but rather asymmetrical generosity from whoever finds continued warfare more costly than imperfect peace. Breaking generational cycles of resentment often requires someone to make financial and emotional contributions that will never be fully recognized or appreciated. The compound interest must be forgiven rather than collected if the family system is going to survive. Part 10. Cancel culture as public emotional accounting. Cancel culture represents the digitization and democratization of ancient human impulses for public shaming and social ostracism, transformed into sophisticated collective accounting systems where communities collaborate to calculate appropriate punishments for perceived moral infractions and coordinate economic and social consequences that exceed what any individual could impose alone. Modern social media platforms function as global emotional ledgers where grievances get recorded, interest accumulates through viral sharing, and collection efforts mobilize thousands of strangers who participate in coordinated retaliation against people they have never met for offences they did not personally experience. This represents a fundamental evolution in human emotional mathematics, where individual hurt feelings can be amplified into collective action that destroys careers, relationships and reputations through crowd-sourced revenge that operates with unprecedented speed and reach. Understanding cancel culture through the lens of emotional accounting reveals how digital technology has transformed personal grudges into public spectacles while creating new forms of compound interest where minor infractions can generate massive consequences through collaborative calculation of social debts. The mathematics of public shaming now operate at scales and speeds that would have been unimaginable before social media created instant global communities unified by shared moral outrage. Individual emotional accounting has become collective moral bookkeeping with consequences that often exceed anything traditional justice systems would impose for similar offences. The identification phase of cancel culture dynamics typically begins when someone discovers past or present behaviour that violates current moral standards and decides that public exposure and punishment are necessary to address what they perceive as inadequate accountability from existing institutional systems. The initial calculator of emotional debt may be genuinely injured by the behaviour in question, but social media amplification allows their personal grievance to be adopted by thousands of others who begin their own emotional accounting processes based on second-hand information and projected empathy for victims they do not know. The viral spread of cancel culture incidents follows mathematical principles similar to financial bubbles, where initial modest valuations of harm get inflated through social media feedback loops that reward increasingly dramatic interpretations of the offence and its broader significance. Each share, comment and expression of outrage adds compound interest to the original emotional debt by demonstrating community support for the victim and collective condemnation of the offender. The mathematics of viral outrage consistently bias toward escalation because social media algorithms prioritize engagement, and expressions of moral anger generate more clicks, shares and comments than measured responses that acknowledge complexity or ambiguity. Digital platforms profit from amplifying emotional accounting that might have remained private in previous eras, but now becomes community entertainment that generates advertising revenue from collective participation in public moral mathematics. The calculation phase of cancel culture reveals how collective emotional accounting differs from individual grudge mathematics by incorporating moral frameworks that extend far beyond personal injury to include symbolic representation, cultural power dynamics, and systemic justice considerations that transform individual incidents into broader social statements. A single person's offensive comment gets recalculated as evidence of pervasive discrimination that requires comprehensive response to address not just the immediate harm, but the cultural patterns that the incident supposedly represents. The emotional debt calculation expands to include all similar unreported incidents that the current case symbolizes, all potential victims who might be encouraged by inadequate response, and all systemic inequalities that would be perpetuated by insufficient consequences. This mathematical expansion transforms individual accountability into representative punishment where one person receives consequences calculated to address much larger problems than their specific actions could possibly have caused. The symbolic mathematics of cancel culture consistently generate punishment levels that seem disproportionate to individual offences because the emotional accounting includes collective debts that extend far beyond what any single person could reasonably be expected to pay. Individual cases become vehicles for settling much larger social accounts that have been accumulating interest across decades or centuries of historical injustice. The enforcement phase demonstrates how digital technology enables collective action that can impose consequences more severe than formal legal systems, while operating without the procedural safeguards, proportionality requirements, or appeals processes that traditional justice systems developed to prevent excessive punishment. Social media campaigns can destroy someone's career, reputation, and mental health within days through coordinated pressure on employers, family members and social networks that treat association with the cancelled person as complicity in their moral infractions. The distributed nature of cancel culture enforcement means that no individual participant feels responsible for the cumulative consequences because each person contributes only a small piece of the collective punishment through sharing, commenting, or expressing disapproval that feels proportionate to their individual emotional calculation. However, when thousands of people each contribute their modest emotional accounting, the mathematical sum can exceed anything the original offence warranted while creating a diffusion of responsibility that makes it difficult to recognize or address excessive collective punishment. The mathematics of crowdsourced consequences follow the same compound interest principles as individual grudges, but amplified through social networks that can mobilize global participation in settling emotional debts that began as local or personal conflicts. Digital enforcement creates new forms of emotional mathematics, where individual moral judgments aggregate into collective actions that no participant intended or could control individually. The proportionality problem in cancel culture emerges from fundamental mismatches between the emotional mathematics that individuals use to calculate personal grievances and the collective mathematics that communities use to demonstrate moral solidarity and social progress. Someone who makes a thoughtless comment might deserve criticism, education, or social disapproval, but the viral dynamics of digital outrage can generate consequences that include job loss, death threats, social isolation, and permanent reputation damage that seems wildly disproportionate to the original offence. The mathematical mismatch occurs because individual participants in cancel culture campaigns often calculate their contributions based on the isolated incident they are responding to, while the cumulative effect operates according to collective mathematics that include much larger social and historical contexts. A single inappropriate joke gets punished as if it were systematic harassment. A moment of cultural insensitivity gets treated as deliberate bigotry, and individual mistakes get elevated to represent broader patterns of oppression that require comprehensive response. The emotional accounting becomes distorted because collective action amplifies individual calculations in ways that transform proportionate individual responses into disproportionate collective consequences. Cancel culture mathematics consistently struggle with calibrating punishment to match offence because they operate through aggregation of individual moral calculations that were not designed to produce collective outcomes. The due process deficit in cancel culture emotional accounting creates systematic bias toward punishment without adequate investigation, context consideration, or opportunity for defence that traditional justice systems recognise as essential for fair resolution of serious accusations. Social media outrage cycles operate too quickly to allow for thorough fact-finding, nuanced analysis of context and intent, or consideration of mitigating factors that might change how reasonable people would calculate appropriate consequences. The viral mathematics of digital outrage rewards speed over accuracy, creating incentives for participants to express immediate moral judgment based on limited information rather than waiting for more complete understanding that might complicate the emotional accounting. Cancel culture cases often involve rushing to mathematical conclusion before all relevant factors have been identified or verified, leading to collective punishment that might be modified or withdrawn if more careful calculation were possible. The speed of digital communication makes careful emotional accounting nearly impossible because social media algorithms prioritize fresh content over thorough analysis, and participants who insist on due process get accused of complicity or moral indifference. The mathematics of viral outrage operate according to principles of emotional urgency rather than procedural fairness, consistently biasing toward immediate action over careful calculation of appropriate response. The rehabilitation question in cancel culture reveals fundamental disagreements about whether the emotional mathematics of public accountability should include pathways for redemption, or whether certain moral infractions create permanent debts that can never be fully paid regardless of subsequent behaviour, change, or genuine remorse. Some participants in cancel culture view themselves as operating eternal emotional accounting systems where moral debts never expire and offenders remain permanently excluded from full social participation regardless of their efforts at growth, education or amends-making. Others advocate for redemptive emotional mathematics that allow people to reduce their moral debts through sincere apology, demonstrated behaviour change and contributions to the communities they harmed. This fundamental disagreement about forgiveness and redemption reveals how cancel culture amplifies deeper philosophical questions about human nature, moral development, and the purposes of punishment that have divided ethical thinkers for centuries. The mathematical question becomes whether public emotional accounting should operate like bankruptcy systems that allow for fresh starts after appropriate consequences, or like permanent criminal records that follow people indefinitely, regardless of subsequent moral development. Cancel culture forces communities to confront their basic assumptions about human capacity for change and whether collective emotional mathematics should include mechanisms for debt forgiveness or debt reduction over time. The digital permanence of social media makes these questions newly urgent because online emotional accounting creates permanent records that traditional social shaming systems never maintained. Modern technology has made collective memory perfect while making collective forgiveness nearly impossible. Part 11. The Neuroscience of Forgiveness. Forgiveness activates entirely different neural networks than revenge, creating brain activity patterns that appear to function as neurological reset buttons, capable of literally rewiring our emotional relationship to past injuries and the people who caused them. Advanced brain imaging reveals that when people genuinely forgive those who have wronged them, 3 distinct neurological transformations occur simultaneously that provide immediate relief from emotional pain while restoring cognitive functions that revenge-focused rumination had systematically impaired. First, forgiveness deactivates the anterior insular and other pain-processing regions that had been chronically activated by unresolved grievances, providing actual neurological pain relief rather than merely psychological comfort. Second, it shuts down the nucleus accumbens and dorsal striatum reward circuits that had been generating addictive cravings for retaliation, eliminating the neurochemical drive to continue seeking revenge. Third, forgiveness restores normal activity in the prefrontal cortex and other executive function regions that enable rational decision-making, emotional regulation, and future planning that become impaired when the brain remains locked in revenge-focused processing modes. Understanding the neuroscience of forgiveness reveals that mercy is not just morally admirable but neurologically restorative, providing measurable brain benefits that explain why forgiveness often feels like awakening from a psychological nightmare. The pain relief mechanism of forgiveness operates through deactivation of brain networks that had been treating emotional injuries as ongoing physical threats, requiring constant vigilance and defensive preparation. Chronic resentment keeps pain-processing regions in a state of heightened activation that creates genuine suffering comparable to physical injury, with neuroimaging studies showing that people carrying long-term grudges display brain activity patterns similar to those experiencing chronic pain conditions. When forgiveness occurs, these pain networks downregulate dramatically, often within minutes of the decision to let go of resentment, providing immediate relief that can feel miraculous to people who had been suffering for months or years from unresolved emotional injuries. The neurological pain relief explains why forgiveness can feel like physical healing and why people often describe the experience using medical metaphors about wounds closing, pressure lifting, or knots untying. Brain chemistry research shows that forgiveness triggers release of endorphins and other natural pain-relieving substances that provide genuine comfort comparable to pharmaceutical interventions, suggesting that mercy literally functions as medicine for emotional wounds. The pain relief mechanism appears to work independently of whether the forgiven person acknowledges their wrongdoing or changes their behavior, indicating that forgiveness serves neurological self-care functions that operate regardless of external validation or reciprocal responses. The addiction interruption function of forgiveness works by breaking neurochemical cycles that had made revenge-seeking feel compulsively necessary, despite its failure to provide lasting satisfaction. People trapped in chronic resentment often develop brain patterns remarkably similar to substance addiction, with their reward systems becoming dependent on fantasies of retaliation and their emotional regulation, systems becoming unable to function normally without regular doses of righteous anger. Forgiveness interventions show measurable effects on these addiction-like patterns within remarkably short time periods, often producing detectable changes in brain activity after single therapy sessions focused on mercy and letting go. The neurochemical shift involves rebalancing dopamine and serotonin systems that had become dysregulated through chronic revenge preoccupation, restoring natural reward responsiveness that allows people to find satisfaction in present-moment experiences rather than fantasize future vindication. Brain scans of people undergoing forgiveness therapy show decreased activity in addiction-related circuits and increased activity in reward regions associated with genuine contentment and social connection. The addiction interruption mechanism helps explain why forgiveness often feels initially difficult but becomes progressively easier as brain chemistry rebalances and people rediscover their capacity for happiness that does not depend on others' suffering. The cognitive restoration effects of forgiveness appear most dramatically in improvements to working memory, attention regulation, and complex problem-solving abilities that become impaired when mental resources are chronically devoted to rumination and revenge planning. Psychological testing reveals that people carrying significant grudges often show cognitive deficits similar to those produced by sleep deprivation or chronic stress, with their intellectual functioning measurably compromised by the mental energy devoted to maintaining emotional accounting systems and rehearsing retaliation scenarios. Forgiveness interventions typically produce rapid improvements in cognitive performance that can be measured through standardized testing, with participants showing enhanced memory, improved attention span, and better executive function within days or weeks of beginning mercy-focused therapeutic work. The cognitive restoration occurs because forgiveness frees up mental resources that had been unconsciously devoted to vigilance, threat assessment and revenge planning, allowing these resources to be redirected toward more productive forms of information processing and problem-solving. Neuroplasticity research suggests that chronic resentment can actually reshape brain structure in ways that prioritize threat detection and retaliatory thinking over cognitive flexibility and creative problem-solving. Forgiveness appears to reverse some of these structural changes through mechanisms that remain partially mysterious, but consistently produce measurable improvements in intellectual functioning and emotional regulation. The social cognition enhancement that accompanies genuine forgiveness involves restoration of empathy, perspective-taking, and theory of mind capabilities that become systematically impaired when people remain focused on past injuries and future revenge. Chronic resentment tends to reduce people's ability to understand others' mental states, motivations, and emotional experiences, because revenge-focused thinking requires maintaining simplified models of human behavior, where offenders are consistently evil and victims are consistently innocent. Forgiveness interventions typically produce measurable improvements in empathy tests and social cognition assessments as people regain their capacity to understand complex human motivations and recognize their own contributions to interpersonal conflicts. The social cognition restoration appears to work through reactivation of brain networks involved in mentalizing and perspective-taking that become suppressed when emotional accounting systems demand black-and-white moral calculations. People who successfully forgive often report improved relationships across their entire social network, not just with the specific individuals they forgave, suggesting that mercy enhances general social skills rather than merely resolving specific conflicts. The social cognition benefits help explain why forgiveness programs often produce improvements in marriage satisfaction, parenting effectiveness, and workplace relationships that extend far beyond the original therapeutic targets. The stress response normalization that follows authentic forgiveness involves comprehensive rebalancing of hormonal and autonomic nervous systems that had been chronically activated by unresolved emotional debts and ongoing vigilance for additional threats. Chronic resentment keeps stress response systems in a state of partial activation that elevates cortisol, increases blood pressure, suppresses immune function, and disrupts sleep patterns in ways that create genuine health risks over extended time periods. Forgiveness interventions consistently produce measurable improvements in these physiological stress markers, often within weeks of beginning mercy-focused therapeutic work, with participants showing decreased cortisol, improved cardiovascular function, and enhanced immune system activity. The stress normalization effects appear to result from forgiveness eliminating the psychological vigilance and threat assessment that had been keeping fight-or-flight systems partially engaged even during periods of apparent calm and safety. Medical research reveals that people who learn to forgive effectively show reduced rates of cardiovascular disease, improved immune function, better sleep quality, and enhanced longevity compared to matched control groups who continue carrying unresolved resentments. The health benefits of forgiveness appear to operate through multiple pathways, including stress reduction, improved social support, and enhanced self-care behaviors that become possible when mental energy is no longer devoted to maintaining grudges. The neuroplasticity of forgiveness suggests that mercy skills can be developed and strengthened through specific practices that literally reshape brain structure and function in ways that make future forgiveness easier and more automatic. Meditation, loving-kindness practice, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other forgiveness-focused interventions produce measurable changes in brain connectivity and regional activation patterns that persist long after formal training ends. People who undergo forgiveness training show enhanced connectivity between emotional processing centers and regulatory brain regions, increased grey matter density in areas associated with empathy and emotional regulation, and decreased reactivity in threat detection systems that had been hypervigilant for additional injuries. The neuroplasticity research suggests that forgiveness capacity exists on a continuum that can be enhanced through practice rather than representing a fixed personality trait that some people possess and others lack. Brain training programs focused on mercy and compassion show promise for helping people who struggle with chronic resentment develop greater emotional flexibility and reduced vulnerability to developing future grudges. The neuroplasticity findings offer hope that even people with extensive histories of resentment and revenge-seeking can develop greater capacity for forgiveness through interventions that target the underlying brain systems responsible for emotional regulation and social cognition. Understanding forgiveness as a learnable neurological skill rather than a moral choice transforms mercy from religious idealism into practical brain training, with measurable benefits for cognitive function, emotional regulation, and physical health. The neuroscience of forgiveness reveals that mercy is not sacrifice but self-optimization through strategic rewiring of maladaptive brain patterns that had been creating unnecessary suffering. Part 12. International Relations and the Arithmetic of Nations. Nations engage in emotional accounting systems that operate with the same mathematical principles as individual grudges, but amplified through institutional memory, cultural narratives, and diplomatic protocols that can preserve and compound resentments across centuries of international relations. Countries maintain sophisticated ledgers of historical grievances that include territorial disputes, trade conflicts, military interventions, broken treaties, and perceived slights to national honour that accumulate compound interest through commemorative rituals, educational curricula, and political rhetoric that keeps ancient wounds fresh in collective consciousness. International emotional mathematics follow predictable patterns where nations assign different values to identical actions based on power relationships, cultural differences, timing considerations, and symbolic significance that can transform minor diplomatic incidents into major crises requiring years of careful negotiation to resolve. Understanding how countries calculate emotional debts reveals why international conflicts often seem wildly disproportionate to their immediate causes, and why diplomatic resolution requires addressing not just current disagreements but accumulated resentments that may date back generations or centuries. The Arithmetic of Nations demonstrates that forgiveness operates as a crucial diplomatic tool that can break cycles of international retaliation while creating opportunities for cooperation that benefit all parties involved. International relations represent the ultimate test of whether sophisticated emotional accounting leads to prosperity or destruction when applied at civilizational scales. Historical grievances between nations operate according to compound interest principles that can make centuries-old conflicts feel as immediate and urgent as current disputes through institutional mechanisms that preserve and amplify collective memory of past injustices. Countries develop comprehensive narratives about how they have been wronged by other nations that get reinforced through educational systems, media coverage, political speeches, and cultural productions that ensure each new generation inherits the emotional debts of their predecessors. These inherited grievances often become central to national identity in ways that make forgiveness feel like betrayal of ancestors who suffered and died defending national honour against foreign aggression or exploitation. The emotional accounting becomes intergenerational when historical injuries get treated as ongoing debts that current populations must continue collecting, regardless of how much time has passed or how much circumstances have changed. International compound interest explains why conflicts in regions like the Balkans, Middle East and South Asia can seem intractable despite involving nations that share obvious common interests in trade, security and regional development. The mathematical logic of accumulated resentment can make cooperation feel impossible even when collaboration would clearly benefit everyone involved. Historical grievances create emotional mathematics, where current costs of continued conflict get outweighed by perceived costs of letting go of legitimate claims for justice or compensation that ancestors died defending. Nations can become addicted to their grievances in ways that systematically undermine their practical interests in prosperity and security. Territorial disputes reveal how emotional attachment to specific geographical areas can create emotional accounting systems that value symbolic possession far beyond any rational calculation of economic or strategic importance. Small islands, remote mountain regions, and arbitrary border demarcations can generate international crises that cost far more to maintain than the disputed territories could ever be worth, because the emotional mathematics include considerations of national honour, historical precedent, and domestic political credibility that multiply basic economic calculations exponentially. The Falkland Islands conflict between Britain and Argentina demonstrated how emotional valuations of territorial sovereignty can justify military expenditures that exceed the economic value of the disputed territory by orders of magnitude when national pride and political legitimacy become part of the accounting equation. Similarly, ongoing disputes over uninhabited rocks in the South China Sea involve emotional calculations, where yielding any claim feels like comprehensive defeat that would encourage additional challenges to national sovereignty throughout the region. Territorial emotional mathematics often follow zero-sum logic, where any gain for one nation automatically represents loss for another, making creative solutions like joint administration or resource sharing feel like unsatisfactory compromises that fail to address the fundamental question of who has legitimate authority over disputed areas. The emotional investment in territorial claims can make rational cost-benefit analysis nearly impossible, because abandoning territory feels like abandoning national identity and historical legitimacy regardless of practical considerations. Trade and economic conflicts between nations demonstrate how financial disagreements can escalate into comprehensive emotional warfare when economic policies get interpreted as deliberate attempts to undermine national prosperity and independence. Trade deficits, currency manipulations, intellectual property disputes, and market access restrictions generate emotional accounting that extends far beyond immediate economic impacts to include perceived threats to national sovereignty, cultural autonomy, and future competitiveness that transform business disagreements into existential struggles. The emotional mathematics of international trade often involve calculations where short-term economic costs of retaliation seem justified by long-term benefits of demonstrating resolve and discouraging additional economic aggression from other nations. Countries can impose tariffs, sanctions, and trade restrictions that harm their own economies more than their intended targets, because the emotional satisfaction of striking back outweighs rational economic analysis in political systems where appearing tough matters more than optimizing prosperity. International economic resentment follows compound interest patterns where initial trade disputes expand into comprehensive campaigns to reduce economic dependence and develop alternative partnerships that may prove less efficient but feel more emotionally satisfying than continued cooperation with nations perceived as exploitative or untrustworthy. The emotional mathematics can make economically beneficial relationships feel politically impossible when domestic populations view trade cooperation as submission to foreign manipulation rather than mutually beneficial exchange. Diplomatic protocol violations and perceived slights to national honour can generate emotional accounting crises that seem wildly disproportionate to outside observers, but feel existentially important to nations whose international credibility depends on consistent demonstration of strength and refusal to accept disrespectful treatment. Cancelled diplomatic visits, inappropriate seating arrangements, translation errors and breaches of ceremonial protocol can escalate into major international incidents because they get calculated as deliberate attempts to signal disrespect or diminished status, rather than innocent mistakes or administrative oversights. The emotional mathematics of diplomatic respect operate according to symbolic logic, where every interaction gets analysed for hidden messages about relative power, cultural superiority, and future relationship expectations that may have profound implications for domestic political legitimacy. and international negotiating position. Nations often feel compelled to respond dramatically to relatively minor protocol violations because failing to defend national dignity can be interpreted by other countries as weakness that invites additional challenges and by domestic populations as leadership failure that justifies political change. The compound interest of accumulated diplomatic slights can create atmospheres of suspicion and hostility that make productive international cooperation nearly impossible, even when all parties recognize their shared interests in addressing common challenges like climate change, terrorism, or economic instability. Diplomatic emotional accounting can trap nations in cycles of mutual retaliation over ceremonial issues, while preventing collaboration on substantive problems that affect their citizens' welfare and security. International forgiveness and reconciliation efforts demonstrate how sophisticated diplomatic engineering can break cycles of national resentment while creating new foundations for cooperation that benefit all parties involved. The Franco-German reconciliation after World War II represents perhaps the most successful example of international emotional debt forgiveness, transforming centuries of warfare and mutual hostility into comprehensive partnership that anchored European integration and created unprecedented prosperity and security for both nations. This transformation required deliberate emotional mathematics that prioritized future benefits of cooperation over historical claims for justice, with both countries making conscious decisions to forgive massive grievances in service of creating better outcomes for subsequent generations. The reconciliation process involved systematic efforts to rewrite national narratives, redesign educational curricula, create cultural exchange programs, and develop economic partnerships that made continued conflict feel counterproductive rather than necessary for national honor. International forgiveness requires sophisticated cost-benefit analysis that calculates the long-term advantages of letting go of legitimate grievances against the ongoing costs of maintaining defensive hostility and missed opportunities for beneficial cooperation. Successful international reconciliation often involves asymmetric forgiveness, where one nation provides more emotional generosity than strict fairness would require because the benefits of restored relationships exceed the psychological costs of incomplete justice. Regional integration projects, like the European Union, demonstrate how international emotional accounting can be restructured to create positive-sum mathematics where former enemies develop shared interests that make continued conflict feel economically and politically impossible. By creating institutional frameworks that reward cooperation and penalize unilateral aggression, regional integration changes the emotional mathematics of international relations from zero-sum competition to collaborative problem-solving, where everyone benefits from shared prosperity and security. The European integration process required participating nations to gradually transfer sovereignty over specific policy areas to supranational institutions that could mediate disputes and coordinate responses to common challenges in ways that made bilateral conflicts feel archaic and counterproductive. This institutional approach to international forgiveness works by creating new emotional accounting systems where national success gets measured partly through contribution to collective welfare rather than exclusively through competitive advantage over neighboring countries. Regional integration transforms international emotional mathematics by making former enemies into stakeholders in each other's prosperity, while creating shared institutions that can address grievances through legal and political processes rather than military or economic retaliation. The success of international forgiveness often depends on creating new institutional contexts where cooperation becomes more rewarding than continued competition, and where shared challenges require collaborative responses that make historical grudges feel like expensive luxuries that prevent effective problem-solving. Understanding international relations as emotional accounting systems reveals that diplomatic forgiveness is not naive idealism, but sophisticated realism about what strategies actually work for creating prosperity, security, and influence in increasingly interconnected global systems. The arithmetic of nations consistently favors cooperation over competition when calculated across realistic time horizons that include the compound costs of permanent defensive positioning and missed opportunities for beneficial partnership. Part 13. The mathematics of meaningful apologies. Apologies operate as complex emotional transactions that attempt to balance psychological ledgers through carefully calculated combinations of acknowledgement, responsibility, remorse, and behavioral change, promises that must satisfy sophisticated internal accounting systems before forgiveness becomes psychologically possible. The mathematics of meaningful apologies involve precise calibration of several distinct components that each address specific aspects of the emotional debt created by harmful actions, with successful reconciliation requiring adequate coverage of acknowledgement that validates the victim's experience, responsibility, acceptance that satisfies their need for accountability, genuine remorse that demonstrates appropriate emotional impact, and credible commitment to behavior change that reduces future threat assessment. Understanding why some apologies feel deeply satisfying while others seem insulting or inadequate reveals the complex psychological mathematics that govern how humans calculate whether emotional debts have been sufficiently addressed to justify releasing resentment and restoring relationship trust. The emotional accounting systems that evaluate apologies operate according to predictable principles that can help both offenders and victims understand what elements are necessary for genuine reconciliation, and why superficial expressions of regret so often fail to resolve conflicts or restore damaged relationships. Meaningful apologies require sophisticated understanding of the specific emotional mathematics that determine whether victims will experience psychological closure or continued resentment, regardless of the offender's stated intentions or feelings. The science of apology reveals that reconciliation depends more on mathematical precision in addressing psychological needs than on emotional sincerity or moral good intentions. The acknowledgement component of meaningful apologies must demonstrate accurate understanding of what specifically happened and how it affected the victim, with precision that proves the offender has invested sufficient mental energy to comprehend the full scope of harm they caused, rather than minimizing or misrepresenting the incident to reduce their own psychological discomfort. Victims' emotional accounting systems carefully evaluate whether apologies include detailed recognition of specific actions, accurate assessment of their impact, and appropriate understanding of why those impacts were harmful in ways that validate the victim's experience rather than offering generic expressions of regret that could apply to any situation. The acknowledgement mathematics require offenders to demonstrate that they have genuinely engaged with the victim's perspective, rather than simply expressing whatever remorse seems strategically necessary to restore relationship equilibrium or avoid further consequences. Inadequate acknowledgement feels insulting, because it suggests the offender has not invested sufficient effort to understand what they did wrong, indicating either continued disrespect for the victim or emotional laziness that makes future harm more likely. Meaningful acknowledgement often requires offenders to recognize impacts they had not initially considered, understand perspectives they had not previously appreciated, and validate experiences they may have initially minimized or dismissed as overreaction. The acknowledgement component functions as proof that the offender has updated their mental model of the victim's inner life and will therefore be less likely to repeat similar mistakes in future interactions. Victims often remain resentful after receiving apologies that feel inadequate, primarily because insufficient acknowledgement suggests continued fundamental misunderstanding that indicates high probability of repeated harm. The emotional mathematics treat acknowledgement accuracy as predictive data about future relationship safety and offender reliability. Responsibility acceptance represents the most mathematically crucial component of meaningful apologies because it determines whether victims will experience the psychological satisfaction of having their reality validated by the person whose actions created doubt about their perceptions, worth, or judgment. Emotional accounting systems carefully evaluate whether apologies include unambiguous acceptance of causality that avoids deflection, excuse-making, or responsibility dilution that would reduce the offender's accountability and therefore diminish the psychological value of their acknowledgement. Responsibility mathematics operate according to zero-sum logic, where any attempt to share blame with circumstances, other people, or the victim themselves proportionally reduces the emotional satisfaction that comes from having one's experience validated by clear admission of wrongdoing. Victims often reject apologies that include phrases like "mistakes were made," "if I hurt you," or "I'm sorry you felt that way," because these formulations avoid the direct causal responsibility that psychological closure requires. Meaningful responsibility acceptance requires offenders to use active voice constructions that clearly identify themselves as the agent of harmful actions, rather than passive voice formulations that obscure agency and reduce psychological impact. The emotional mathematics demand statements like "I betrayed your trust," rather than "trust was broken," or "I made a poor decision that hurt you," rather than "poor decisions were made that resulted in hurt feelings." Responsibility acceptance serves psychological functions beyond mere factual accuracy by providing victims with the social validation that their experience of being wronged was legitimate and their emotional response was appropriate rather than oversensitive or mistaken. The mathematics of responsibility require offenders to explicitly contradict any gaslighting or reality distortion that may have accompanied the original harmful actions. Remorse demonstration involves emotional expression that proves the offender has experienced appropriate psychological discomfort about their actions, rather than feeling primarily concerned about consequences, inconvenience, or damage to their own reputation and relationships. Victims' emotional accounting systems evaluate remorse authenticity through multiple indicators including emotional intensity, specificity of regret, evidence of genuine empathy for victim experience, and demonstration that the offender's distress focuses on harm caused rather than problems created for themselves. Authentic remorse mathematics require offenders to show that they have internalized appropriate emotional consequences for their actions rather than simply expressing strategic regret designed to minimize external consequences or restore social standing. Victims often reject apologies where remorse seems primarily focused on the offender's reputation damage, relationship problems, or practical difficulties rather than genuine concern for the harm they inflicted on others. Meaningful remorse requires emotional vulnerability that demonstrates the offender has allowed themselves to fully experience the psychological impact of recognizing how their actions affected someone they claim to care about. The mathematics of authentic remorse include evidence that the offender has spent significant time and emotional energy processing their actions rather than simply expressing whatever level of regret seems necessary to achieve forgiveness. Remorse serves psychological functions by providing victims with evidence that offenders have internalized appropriate moral and emotional feedback that will help prevent similar actions in the future. The emotional accounting treats authentic remorse as predictive data about the offender's capacity for empathy and moral development that affects assessment of relationship safety and future trustworthiness. Behavioral change commitment represents the forward-looking component of apology mathematics that addresses victims' practical concerns about future relationship safety rather than merely settling accounts about past harm. Meaningful behavioral change promises must include specific action plans that address the underlying causes of harmful behavior rather than generic commitments to do better or be more careful that provide no concrete information about how recurrence will be prevented. The mathematics of credible commitment require offenders to demonstrate understanding of what specific changes in their thinking, habits, relationships, or circumstances will be necessary to reduce the probability of similar incidents occurring in future interactions. Victims' emotional accounting systems evaluate behavioral change commitments based on their specificity, realism, measurability, and evidence that the offender has invested serious effort in understanding what systemic changes will be necessary, rather than simply promising increased effort or attention. Meaningful behavioral change commitments often include concrete steps like therapy, education, skill development, relationship changes, or lifestyle modifications that address root causes rather than merely symptoms of the behavior that created harm. The commitment mathematics require evidence that offenders understand their actions resulted from systemic issues that require systematic solutions, rather than isolated mistakes that can be prevented through increased willpower or good intentions. Behavioral change promises serve psychological functions by providing victims with concrete data about future relationship safety that allows them to make informed decisions about whether continued interaction serves their interests. The emotional mathematics treat commitment, specificity, and realism as predictive information about whether forgiveness represents genuine resolution or merely temporary conflict avoidance that will require repeated renegotiation. Timing considerations in apology mathematics involve complex calculations about when expressions of remorse will feel genuine versus manipulative, based on the offender's apparent motivations and the external pressures that may be driving their decision to apologize. Apologies that occur only after consequences become apparent often feel less emotionally satisfying than those that emerge from apparent conscience or concern for victim welfare, with timing serving as evidence about the offender's underlying character and moral development. The mathematics of apology timing include assessment of whether remorse expression feels driven by genuine recognition of wrongdoing or strategic calculation about how to minimize external consequences and restore social standing. Victims often remain resentful after receiving apologies that seem primarily motivated by legal concerns, employment consequences, relationship pressures, or social embarrassment, rather than authentic concern for the harm they caused. Meaningful apology timing requires offenders to express remorse at moments when doing so serves victim welfare rather than offender interests, demonstrating that their primary concern involves making amends rather than managing their own reputation or practical situation. The emotional accounting systems that evaluate apology authenticity often treat timing as crucial evidence about whether expressions of remorse reflect genuine moral development or merely tactical maneuvering designed to achieve practical objectives. Timing mathematics become particularly complex when Offenders delay apologies until they feel emotionally ready to express authentic remorse, rather than offering immediate expressions that might feel superficial or strategically motivated. The optimal timing for meaningful apologies often requires offenders to balance victim needs for timely acknowledgement against their own needs for sufficient emotional processing to ensure authentic, rather than performative expressions of remorse and commitment. Follow-through accountability represents the most crucial, long-term component of apology mathematics because it determines whether behavioral change commitments prove credible or merely represent strategic promises designed to achieve immediate forgiveness without genuine intention to implement difficult personal changes. Meaningful apologies create ongoing accountability relationships where offenders must demonstrate through sustained action that their commitments were genuine rather than temporary expressions of expedient remorse. The mathematics of follow-through involve complex calculations about whether offenders will invest the time, effort and resources necessary to implement the systematic changes they promised, rather than returning to previous behavior patterns once immediate relationship pressure subsides. Victims' emotional accounting systems continuously evaluate whether apology commitments prove credible through behavioral evidence that extends far beyond initial expressions of remorse and good intentions. Follow-through accountability often requires ongoing communication about progress, setbacks and challenges that provides victims with current information about whether behavioral change efforts are succeeding or whether additional intervention may be necessary. The long-term mathematics of meaningful apologies depend more on sustained behavioral change than on initial emotional expression, with follow-through serving as the ultimate test of whether apologies represented genuine remorse or strategic manipulation. Understanding apology mathematics reveals that successful reconciliation requires sophisticated understanding of psychological needs that extend far beyond simple expressions of regret, to include comprehensive emotional transactions that address acknowledgement, responsibility, remorse, commitment, timing, and follow-through in ways that satisfy complex internal accounting systems. The science of meaningful apologies demonstrates that forgiveness depends more on mathematical precision in addressing psychological needs than on emotional sincerity or moral good intentions from offenders seeking reconciliation. Part 14. Karma as Cosmic Accounting. Buddhist and Hindu concepts of karma represent perhaps the most sophisticated cosmic emotional accounting systems ever developed, proposing mathematical principles that govern how actions generate consequences across multiple lifetimes through universal justice mechanisms that ensure perfect balance between moral debts and their eventual payment, regardless of whether earthly justice systems provide adequate accountability. Karmic mathematics operate according to precise laws that calculate not just the immediate effects of actions, but their reverberating consequences through complex causal networks that can extend across generations, lifetimes, and dimensional boundaries to ensure that no moral debt remains permanently uncollected and no virtuous action goes ultimately unrewarded. These cosmic accounting systems provide comprehensive frameworks for understanding why life often seems unfair in the short term, while maintaining faith that perfect justice operates according to mathematical principles that human intelligence cannot fully comprehend, but which ensure ultimate moral equilibrium through processes that transcend individual lifetimes and immediate circumstances. Understanding karma as cosmic emotional mathematics reveals how these ancient wisdom traditions developed sophisticated responses to the problem of unresolved grievances that provide psychological alternatives to individual revenge, while maintaining confidence in universal justice that operates according to principles more comprehensive and reliable than human legal or social systems. Karmic accounting represents humanity's most ambitious attempt to solve the mathematical problem of unresolved emotional debts through cosmic systems that guarantee eventual perfect justice for all beings. The mathematics of karma transform individual grudges into cosmic trust that universal principles will ensure appropriate consequences without requiring personal investment in revenge or retaliation. The principle of karmic causation operates according to mathematical laws that connect actions with their consequences through invisible networks of cause and effect that ensure every deed generates proportionate results even when immediate circumstances seem to contradict moral expectations about justice and fairness. Karmic mathematics propose that the universe functions as a perfect accounting system where positive actions create positive karma that will eventually manifest as beneficial circumstances, while negative actions generate negative karma that must be balanced through appropriate suffering or limitation, regardless of how much time passes between cause and effect. These cosmic calculations include not just external actions, but internal motivations, emotional states, and mental formations that contribute to overall karmic balance through psychological mechanisms that affect future circumstances in ways that purely behavioral accounting systems cannot capture. The mathematical precision of karmic law suggests that consequences occur not through divine intervention or conscious cosmic judgment, but through impersonal universal principles that operate with the same reliability as physical laws governing gravity, electromagnetism, or thermodynamics. Karmic accounting proposes that moral universe operates according to conservation principles where positive and negative energy must ultimately balance across extended time frames that may require multiple lifetimes to complete the mathematical equations that ensure perfect justice. The cosmic mathematics eliminate the need for individual revenge by guaranteeing that universal systems will provide more comprehensive and accurate justice than human beings could achieve through personal retaliation or institutional legal processes. Individual karmic accounts operate according to sophisticated mathematics that track not just personal actions and their consequences, but also collective karma generated through participation in group activities, inherited karma from family and cultural lineages, and accumulated karma from previous lifetimes that influences current circumstances through cosmic accounting systems that maintain perfect records across unlimited time spans. Personal karmic mathematics include calculations for intentional actions, unintentional consequences, thoughts and emotions that generate karmic energy, and responses to situations that test character and moral development in ways that either improve or worsen overall karmic balance. The individual accounting recognizes that people inherit karmic debts and credits from previous incarnations that help explain why some individuals seem to face disproportionate challenges or receive unearned advantages that appear unfair when calculated according to current lifetime actions alone. Karmic mathematics also include collective responsibility calculations, where individuals participate in group karma generated by their families, communities, nations, and species through associations that create shared karmic consequences for collective actions that affect other beings. The cosmic accounting systems track how individual choices contribute to larger patterns of harmony or suffering that generate collective karmic consequences shared among all participants in social systems that cause benefit or harm to other conscious beings. Personal karmic accounts operate within larger collective calculations that ensure individual actions receive appropriate consequences while also balancing group karma generated through social participation in systems that affect the welfare of other sentient beings. The mathematical principle of karmic interest suggests that unresolved moral debts accumulate additional karmic weight over time when people avoid taking responsibility for harmful actions or fail to make appropriate amends for damage they have caused to other beings. Karmic compound interest operates through psychological and spiritual mechanisms where unacknowledged wrongdoing creates additional karmic debt through the ongoing harm caused by refusing to take responsibility, express genuine remorse, or make appropriate restitution for past actions. The cosmic mathematics recognize that denial, justification, and avoidance of accountability generate additional negative karma beyond the original harmful actions because they represent continued choices to prioritize self-protection over moral development and concern for others' welfare. Karmic interest calculations include the cumulative effects of persistent selfishness, lack of empathy, and refusal to engage in moral growth that compounds original karmic debts through ongoing patterns of behavior that demonstrate unchanged character and continued potential for similar harmful actions. The compound interest mechanism explains why karmic consequences sometimes seem disproportionately severe compared to original actions, since cosmic accounting includes not just initial harm, but accumulated additional karma generated through persistent refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing or develop greater moral sensitivity. Karmic mathematics provide incentives for immediate acknowledgement and appropriate response to moral failures because early accountability prevents compound interest from accumulating additional karmic debt that must eventually be balanced through corresponding suffering or limitation. Karmic forgiveness operates according to cosmic mathematics that distinguish between releasing personal resentment and interfering with universal justice systems that ensure appropriate consequences for harmful actions regardless of whether victims choose to maintain personal grudges or emotional investment in outcomes. Buddhist and Hindu teachings suggest that forgiveness serves individual liberation from negative karma generated by anger, resentment, and revenge desires while allowing cosmic justice systems to operate without personal interference or emotional investment in specific outcomes. The karmic mathematics of forgiveness recognize that maintaining grudges creates negative karma for the victim through ongoing anger, hatred, and desire for revenge that generate additional suffering and karmic debt beyond what was created by the original harmful actions. Forgiveness becomes mathematically optimal because it eliminates negative karmic consequences for the victim while trusting cosmic accounting systems to ensure appropriate consequences for perpetrators through universal justice mechanisms that operate more effectively than personal revenge efforts. Karmic forgiveness mathematics demonstrate that releasing resentment serves self-interest by preventing additional karmic debt accumulation while maintaining confidence that universal principles will ensure perfect justice through processes that transcend individual understanding or control. The cosmic accounting approach transforms forgiveness from moral idealism into practical karmic optimization that eliminates personal karmic liability while trusting universal systems to provide more comprehensive justice than human revenge efforts could achieve. Karmic rebirth mathematics propose that consciousness continues after physical death and inherits karmic accounts that determine circumstances of subsequent incarnations through cosmic justice systems that ensure perfect balance between past actions and future experiences across unlimited lifetimes. Reincarnation accounting suggests that current life circumstances reflect karmic consequences from previous incarnations, while current actions generate karmic conditions that will influence future births through mathematical principles that ensure ultimate justice across extended time frames that transcend individual lifetimes. The rebirth mathematics provide comprehensive explanations for apparent injustices and inequalities that seem random or unfair when calculated according to current lifetime actions alone, but represent perfect karmic balance when understood as consequences of accumulated actions across multiple incarnations. Karmic rebirth accounting eliminates the need for immediate justice or personal revenge by guaranteeing that cosmic systems will ensure appropriate consequences through future incarnations that provide perfect opportunities for karmic balancing, regardless of how much time is required to complete the mathematical equations. The reincarnation framework transforms individual grudges into cosmic patience that trusts universal justice systems to provide more comprehensive accountability than earthly legal systems or personal retaliation efforts could achieve within single lifetimes. Karmic rebirth mathematics offer ultimate resolution for unresolved emotional debts by guaranteeing that cosmic accounting systems will ensure perfect justice across unlimited time frames that make personal investment in revenge unnecessary and counterproductive for individual spiritual development. Liberation from karmic mathematics represents the ultimate goal of spiritual development, where consciousness transcends individual emotional accounting systems and cosmic justice calculations through enlightenment that eliminates the psychological mechanisms that generate karmic debt and credit accumulation. Buddhist and Hindu teachings suggest that advanced spiritual practitioners can escape karmic mathematics entirely by developing consciousness that no longer operates according to individual self-interest, personal preferences, or emotional reactions that create karmic consequences through attachment and aversion to specific outcomes. Liberation mathematics propose that enlightenment eliminates karmic accounting by transcending the psychological foundations that generate moral debt through actions motivated by ignorance, selfishness, and emotional reactivity that create suffering for self and others. The ultimate karmic mathematics involve dissolving individual identity that participates in cosmic accounting systems through spiritual development that eliminates the psychological basis for generating additional karma while resolving accumulated karmic debts through compassionate service and wisdom development. Understanding karma as cosmic emotional mathematics reveals how these ancient wisdom traditions developed comprehensive responses to human desires for justice that provide alternatives to individual revenge while maintaining confidence in universal principles that ensure perfect moral balance through systems that transcend human understanding and control. Karmic accounting represents humanity's most sophisticated attempt to solve the mathematical problem of unresolved grievances through cosmic trust that eliminates the need for personal investment in emotional debt collection while guaranteeing ultimate justice through universal principles that operate with perfect accuracy across unlimited time frames. The mathematics of karma transform individual grudges into cosmic patience that serves both personal liberation and universal justice through spiritual development that transcends emotional accounting while maintaining faith in perfect cosmic equilibrium. Liberation from karmic mathematics represents the ultimate forgiveness where consciousness transcends individual emotional accounting entirely, while trusting cosmic systems to ensure perfect justice without personal involvement or emotional investment in specific outcomes. Part 15. Breaking the Cycle, the Liberation Equation. The mathematics of emotional debt create profound human suffering through psychological systems that evolved for survival in small tribal groups, but become maladaptive torture devices in modern complex societies where grudges can persist indefinitely without resolution and compound interest on resentment can consume entire lifetimes with recursive anger and revenge fantasies. Breaking free from destructive emotional accounting requires conscious recognition that our internal ledger systems often create more suffering than the original injuries they were designed to address. followed by deliberate intervention in the mathematical processes that transform isolated incidents into comprehensive worldviews organized around victimhood and retaliation. The liberation equation involves calculating whether continued investment in emotional debt collection serves our genuine interests in happiness, growth, connection and meaningful contribution, or whether these accounting systems have become psychological prisons that prevent us from accessing the joy, creativity and love that make human life worth living. Understanding how to interrupt the compound interest of resentment requires sophisticated analysis of the specific mathematical processes that maintain grudges, combined with practical strategies for redirecting mental and emotional energy toward outcomes that actually improve our lives rather than merely satisfying our desire for vindication and justice. The ultimate mathematics of human flourishing consistently favor forgiveness over revenge, when calculated across realistic time horizons that include the comprehensive costs of maintaining defensive emotional positions versus the benefits of psychological freedom and restored capacity for positive engagement with life's possibilities. Breaking the cycle requires courage to abandon familiar emotional mathematics in favor of new equations that prioritize well-being over being right. Recognizing the addiction potential of revenge fantasies represents the first crucial step in interrupting emotional accounting cycles, because it allows us to understand how neurochemical reward systems make resentment feel psychologically necessary, even when it serves no practical purpose in improving our circumstances or preventing future harm. Revenge addiction operates through the same neurological mechanisms as substance abuse, gambling compulsion, and other behavioral patterns that provide immediate neurochemical gratification while systematically undermining long-term psychological health and life satisfaction. The recognition process involves honest assessment of how much mental and emotional energy we devote to rumination, revenge planning, and monitoring our enemies for signs of comeuppance compared to time invested in activities that actually generate positive outcomes for ourselves and people we care about. Breaking revenge addiction often requires acknowledging that our emotional accounting systems have become more important to us than our actual relationships, creative projects, personal growth, or contribution to meaningful causes that could provide genuine satisfaction and sense of purpose. The addiction recognition allows us to see that revenge fantasies function as emotional junk food that provides immediate psychological comfort, while preventing us from developing the emotional skills and life engagement that would provide more sustainable forms of happiness and meaning. Understanding resentment as addiction rather than justified response creates opportunities for intervention strategies that address the underlying neurochemical and psychological mechanisms, rather than simply trying to convince ourselves that forgiveness is morally superior to revenge. Cost-benefit analysis of ongoing grudges involves honest calculation of what maintaining emotional debts actually costs us in terms of mental energy, stress-related health problems, damaged relationships, missed opportunities, and reduced capacity for joy and creativity compared to whatever psychological benefits we derive from feeling righteously angry and morally superior to those who have wronged us. The comprehensive accounting must include not just the obvious costs of chronic anger and rumination, but also the opportunity costs of mental and emotional resources that could be redirected toward activities that actually improve our lives, rather than merely providing neurochemical rewards for rehearsing past injuries. Many people discover through careful cost-benefit analysis that their emotional accounting systems consume far more psychological energy than the original injuries warranted, and generate far more ongoing suffering than the initial harm ever caused. The mathematical analysis often reveals that we have become more invested in our grievances than in our goals, more committed to proving we were wronged than to creating positive outcomes that would make the original injuries irrelevant to our current life satisfaction. Cost-benefit calculation frequently demonstrates that maintaining grudges serves our ego needs for moral superiority and victim status, rather than our genuine interests in happiness, growth, and meaningful connection with others who could enrich our lives if we were emotionally available for positive relationships. The analysis process helps distinguish between emotional accounting that serves legitimate protective functions and resentment that has become psychologically expensive habit that prevents us from accessing our full potential for creativity, joy, and love. Developing forgiveness as a practical skill, rather than a moral obligation, transforms mercy from abstract ethical ideal into concrete psychological technology that can be learned, practiced, and refined through specific techniques that target the neurological and cognitive mechanisms that maintain resentment and revenge desires. Forgiveness skills include mindfulness practices that help us observe our revenge thoughts without automatically believing or acting on them, cognitive restructuring techniques that help us develop more balanced perspectives on past injuries, and emotional regulation strategies that help us manage anger and hurt without getting trapped in reactive cycles that perpetuate suffering. The skill development approach recognizes that forgiveness capacity varies among individuals based on factors including childhood experiences, current stress levels, neurochemical functioning, and learned coping strategies that can be modified through deliberate practice and appropriate support. Learning forgiveness skills often involves working with qualified therapists, meditation teachers, or spiritual advisors who can provide guidance about specific techniques that address individual patterns of resentment and revenge addiction while building emotional resilience and psychological flexibility. The practical approach to forgiveness development emphasizes measurable outcomes including reduced rumination, improved sleep quality, enhanced relationships, increased creative energy, and greater life satisfaction rather than focusing primarily on moral or spiritual ideals that may feel abstract or unattainable. Forgiveness becomes a learnable life skill comparable to physical fitness, financial management, or professional competency that requires ongoing practice and refinement, but provides measurable benefits that justify the effort invested in developing greater emotional flexibility and psychological freedom. Creating new meaning from past injuries involves psychological alchemy that transforms our worst experiences into sources of wisdom, compassion, and strength that can serve our own growth and our ability to help others who face similar challenges, rather than allowing these experiences to remain permanent sources of resentment and limitation. Meaning-making processes help us extract value from our suffering by identifying lessons learned, character strengths developed, empathy enhanced, and insights gained that would not have been accessible without going through difficult experiences that initially seemed purely destructive and unfair. The transformation involves shifting our relationship to past injuries from sources of ongoing grievance to sources of hard-won wisdom that can guide our future decisions and help us support others who struggle with similar challenges or conflicts. Creating meaning from suffering often involves recognizing how our worst experiences have contributed to our capacity for empathy, resilience, authenticity, and appreciation for positive experiences that we might have taken for granted without contrast provided by genuine hardship. The meaning-making process can transform our identity from victim of unfair treatment to survivor who gained valuable understanding about human nature, relationship dynamics, institutional limitations, and personal strength that can serve important purposes in our ongoing life development. Finding meaning in past injuries does not require gratitude for harmful experiences or acceptance of injustice, but rather recognition that we can choose to extract value from experiences we cannot change rather than allowing them to remain purely destructive forces in our psychological development. Building psychological immunity against future injuries involves developing emotional resilience, realistic expectations, appropriate boundaries and response strategies that reduce our vulnerability to devastating hurt while maintaining our capacity for trust, openness, and meaningful connection with others who could enrich our lives. Psychological immunity includes learning to distinguish between reasonable precautions that protect us from unnecessary harm and defensive strategies that prevent us from accessing positive relationships and opportunities because we become too fearful of potential disappointment or betrayal. The immunity development process involves building realistic models of human nature that include both potential for kindness and potential for harm, developing confidence in our ability to recover from injuries rather than trying to prevent all possible hurt, and creating support systems that provide comfort and perspective when inevitable disappointments and conflicts occur. Building psychological resilience often requires learning to validate our own experiences rather than depending entirely on others for confirmation that we have been treated unfairly or that our emotional responses are appropriate to the circumstances we have faced. Psychological immunity includes developing tolerance for ambiguity and complexity in relationships where people can simultaneously be sources of both significant benefit and occasional harm, rather than needing to categorize everyone as completely trustworthy or completely dangerous. The immunity-building process helps us develop emotional stability that allows us to respond to injuries more proportionately, rather than experiencing every conflict as existential threat that requires comprehensive defensive mobilization or total relationship termination. The liberation equation ultimately reveals that human flourishing depends on our capacity to choose growth over grievance, possibility over past injury, and love over the mathematics of emotional debt that can consume our lives with recursive anger and endless calculations of who owes what to whom based on accumulated hurts that may be decades old. True freedom emerges when we recognize that our internal accounting systems are choices rather than facts, that we can modify the emotional mathematics that govern our responses to unfairness, and that we have the power to redirect our mental and emotional energy toward outcomes that actually serve our deepest values and highest aspirations. The mathematics of liberation consistently demonstrate that forgiveness serves self-interest better than revenge when calculated across comprehensive time horizons that include all costs and benefits of different response strategies to interpersonal conflict and injury. Breaking the cycle requires courage to experiment with new emotional mathematics that prioritize psychological freedom over psychological justice, personal growth over personal vindication, and future possibility over past injury in ways that honor our pain without allowing it to become our prison. The ultimate insight of emotional mathematics reveals that we are the accountants of our own psychological ledgers, with complete authority to close books that no longer serve us and open new accounts that support the lives we actually want to create, rather than the grievances we feel compelled to maintain. Liberation from the mathematics of grudges represents the most profound freedom available to human consciousness, the freedom to choose love over the compound interest of resentment, possibility over the prison of past injury, and the courage to write new equations for human happiness that break cycles of suffering that have persisted across generations. The mathematics of grudges ultimately teaches us that we are more than the sum of our injuries, more powerful than our worst experiences, and more capable of joy than our emotional accounting systems often allow us to recognize. When we calculate with forgiveness rather than revenge, when we choose present healing over past accounting, when we risk vulnerability over the safety of permanent resentment, we discover that the most profound mathematics of human experience lead not to endless debt, but to unexpected freedom. Breaking the cycle transforms us from prisoners of our own emotional ledgers into architects of lives that honor our capacity for growth, love, and contribution to the healing of a world that desperately needs people who understand that the highest mathematics are those that add to, rather than subtract from, the total amount of joy and possibility available to conscious beings sharing this brief and precious existence. The liberation equation proves that forgiveness is not weakness, but the ultimate mathematical optimization. Choosing strategies that maximize long-term flourishing over short-term satisfaction, comprehensive well-being over temporary vindication, and the algebra of love over the arithmetic of resentment.